Hey there and welcome back. If the day has wound down at last, and the lamps are low, and you are ready to set the whole weight of it aside and let yourself sink into rest, then you have come to exactly the right place, and there is nothing left for you to do tonight but listen and let go. Tonight I want to carry you back more than 300 years into the England of long skirts and candlelit drawing rooms, and the slow rumble of carriage wheels on cobbled streets, and into the life of a woman who wore a crown that almost no one expected her to wear. She was the last of a famous and ill-fated royal line, a shy and ailing woman who came to the throne worn down by sorrow, and yet, in the years of her reign, her small island kingdom rose to a greatness it had never known before. This is for anyone who understands that a life can hold great public triumph and private heartbreak in the very same hand, who knows that the people history remembers as the heads of golden ages were often, in themselves, the loneliest of souls. So let your breathing slow. Let the small worries of the day drift loose and float away. There is nothing here to hold on to. Only a life to drift alongside as sleep comes softly up to meet you. And by the time her story closes, you will understand how a woman who endured a depth of personal loss almost beyond imagining, who carried and lost child after child until not one was left to follow her, and nonetheless gave her name to an age of glory, and saw two ancient kingdoms joined into one, and a new and greater nation born under her hand. Before we step back into her century, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight, and what hour it has reached where you are. Whether the rain is at the window or the night is still and clear, whether the evening is only beginning for you, or the small hours have already crept in, you are always welcome to leave a word below if the mood takes you, because I do read what you write, and there is a quiet pleasure in seeing the far-flung places these stories travel to in the dark. If these long journeys into vanished centuries are something you would like to find your way back to, you are welcome to subscribe, and the next one will be here waiting whenever you need it. There is no hurry about any of it. Just let yourself settle now, and let me carry you back. Picture this. A grey spring morning in London in 1702, and a great procession is making its slow way through the ancient heart of the city towards the Abbey of Westminster, where the kings and queens of England have been crowned for more than 600 years. The bells are ringing out across the rooftops, the crowds are pressed deep along the route, and at the centre of it all moves the woman the whole day is for, the new queen, on her way to set the crown of England upon her head. But she does not walk, as her forebears walked, in the pride of health and youth. She is a woman not yet 40, and already she is so worn by illness and by grief that she cannot make the journey on her own feet, and so she is carried the length of that ancient processional way in an open chair, borne upon the shoulders of her guards, a stout and ailing figure in crimson and ermine, her face patient and composed above the splendour of her robes. The people cheer her as she passes, this last daughter of an unlucky line, and few of them, watching her go by in her chair, would have guessed that the reign now beginning would be remembered as one of the most glorious in the whole long story of the nation. Her name is Anne. Come with me, and let me tell you how she came to that chair, and what the years would make of her. Let me set the scene of the world she was born into, for it shapes everything that follows. The England of her birth was a country only lately emerged from the most terrible upheaval in its history, the long agony of civil war that had set the king against his parliament, divided every county and many a family against itself, and ended in the unthinkable, the public trial and beheading of an anointed king upon a scaffold before his own palace. For a decade after that the country had been a republic, ruled without a king, until the experiment collapsed and the dead king's son was called home from exile to take up his father's crown amid scenes of wild rejoicing. That son was her uncle, and it was his restored and glittering court, half drunk on its deliverance and haunted beneath the gaiety by the memory of catastrophe, that formed the backdrop of her earliest years. It was a court and an age of brilliant and cynical pleasure, a deliberate reaction against the grim, sober years of the Republic that had gone before. The restored king was a witty, charming, indolent, pleasure-loving man who filled his court with beautiful women and clever men and set a tone of elegant license that ran through the whole of fashionable society. There was a glitter to it, and a recklessness, and beneath both a kind of disillusionment, a sense among people who had seen the world turned upside down that nothing was solid and nothing was sacred, and one had best enjoy the day while it lasted. Into this world the grave, shy, devout little princess was born, and she never really belonged to it, for there was nothing of the cynic or the wit or the pleasure-seeker in her. She was a creature of deep and simple feeling in an age of brilliant surfaces, and she would carry the gravity of her nature with her all her life. But if the glitter of the Restoration was not in her nature, its underlying lesson sank deep, for she grew up in the shadow of the knowledge that crowns were not safe, that kings could be cast down and even killed, that the whole bright edifice of monarchy rested upon foundations that had given way once within living memory, and might give way again. Her own grandfather had died upon the scaffold. Her own father would lose his throne before she was a grown woman. She herself would come to the crown through a revolution that drove her family into exile. No sovereign of that troubled century could take the throne for granted, and she least of all, and the deep insecurity of her inheritance bred in her, perhaps, that anxious devotion to duty, that desperate attachment to the church and the law, that marked her whole reign. She had learned early that no splendour was safe, and she governed ever after like a woman who knew it. To find the beginning of her story, we must go back to a London nearly 40 years before that coronation, to the 6th of February in 1665, and to the royal palace of St. James's, where a princess was born into the most glamorous and most precarious family in the land. She was the second surviving daughter of James, Duke of York, the brother of the reigning king, and her birth, though it was a royal birth, stirred no very lively excitement, for she stood a long way from the throne, with her uncle the king above her, and her father and her elder sister, and the prospect of brothers yet to come. She came into a world that had only lately been put back together after a violent upheaval, for her uncle King Charles II had been restored to his throne but a few years earlier, after the long years of civil war, and the killing of his father, and the rule of those who had cast the monarchy down. It was a glittering, cynical, pleasure-loving court into which she was born, the court of the Restoration, and it carried beneath its gaiety the memory of catastrophe, the knowledge that crowns could be lost and kings could die upon a scaffold, and that nothing, however splendid, was ever wholly safe. The particular shadow that lay over her family was the shadow of her grandfather's fate, the most shocking event of the century, and a wound in the memory of the whole nation. He had been a king who believed with a quiet, unshakable conviction that he ruled by the will of God and answered to no earthly power, and that conviction had set him on a collision course with a parliament equally convinced of its own rights, until the quarrel between them broke into open war. The war had torn the country apart for years, and the king had lost it, and his enemies, unable to find any way to live with a defeated but unrepentant monarch, had taken at last the unprecedented and the terrible step of putting him on trial for his life, and cutting off his head before the windows of his own palace. It was a thing that had never been done before, the judicial killing of a crowned king by his own subjects, and it sent a shudder through every throne in Europe, and left a mark on the English imagination that did not fade for generations. The family of that dead king, the memory was a sacred and a terrible thing, the founding tragedy of their house, and they nursed it and brooded on it, and built around it a whole cult of the royal martyr. The murdered king's sons, when they came into their own again, made of their father a saint and a martyr, kept the anniversary of his death as a solemn fast, and never let the nation forget what it had done. And the lesson they drew from it was not the lesson their enemies had hoped to teach, that kings must bow to parliaments, but very nearly the opposite, a deepened conviction of the sacredness of the crown and the wickedness of those who had laid hands on it. It was a dangerous inheritance, this brooding on a royal martyrdom, and it would lead the murdered king's second son, the princess's own father, into the very errors that had destroyed his father, and on to his own ruin. So the princess grew up with the scaffold always somewhere in the background of her mind, the knowledge that the worst could happen because it had happened to her own blood within the memory of men still living. It gave to the Stuart idea of kingship a tragic and an embattled quality, a sense of sacred right forever threatened by faithless subjects, that was both the family's grandeur and the family's doom. She would not, in the end, share her father's and her grandfather's fatal rigidity. She had a saving streak of common sense and of yielding that they lacked, and it helped to preserve her where they had fallen. But the shadow was always there, the family memory of the day. A king of her own house had walked out of a window onto a scaffold and laid his head upon the block, and it is no wonder that she clung so anxiously, all her life, to anything that promised safety. The family into which she was born was the House of Stuart, and it was a family with a genius for misfortune. The Stuarts had come down from Scotland 3 generations before to take the English throne, and from the first they had been dogged by tragedy and disaster, by quarrels with their parliaments and their peoples that ran again and again into catastrophe. Her great-grandfather had been a king, and her grandfather a king who had been beheaded by his own subjects in the most shocking event of the age. Her uncle now reigned, brilliant and idle and childless, and her father, the heir, carried within him the seeds of a fresh disaster. For he had embraced the Roman Catholic faith in a country fiercely and suspiciously Protestant, and his religion would in time cost him his throne. Into this proud, doomed, beautiful dynasty the little princess was born, and she would live to see it fall, and to be, in the end, the last of her line to wear the crown. The House of Stuart, of which she was to be the last crowned representative, had a strange and a melancholy history, almost a genius for snatching disaster out of the jaws of good fortune. They had been kings of Scotland for centuries before they ever came to England, and their Scottish story was a long catalogue of violent deaths and minorities and misfortunes, of kings murdered, and kings killed in battle, and kings dying young, and leaving infants to inherit a turbulent crown, when at last, by a turn of dynastic chance, they inherited the throne of England as well, and seemed to have risen to a height of fortune beyond their ancestors' dreams. The old curse followed them south, and this English century was as full of disaster as their Scottish centuries had been. There was something almost fated in the way they courted ruin, an inability to bend, a fatal mixture of high principle and poor judgment that led them again and again into needless collisions with the people they ruled. The first of them to reign in England quarrelled endlessly with his parliaments, the second lost his head, the third, restored amid such rejoicing, frittered his reign away in pleasure and intrigue, and left no lawful child to follow him. The fourth, the princess's father, threw his throne away in 3 short years through a stubborn devotion to an unpopular faith. It was as though the family could not help itself, as though some flaw woven into its very nature drove it, generation after generation, towards catastrophe, and the clear-eyed among their contemporaries watched the pattern repeat itself with a kind of grim fascination. And the princess was to be the end of it. She would be the last of the Stuarts to wear the crown, the final act of the long tragic drama of her house, and there is a sad fitness in the part she played, as she gathered into her single person both the grandeur and the sorrow of her line. She had the family's deep attachment to the church and the crown, the family's stubbornness, the family's capacity for suffering, and she had too, more than any of them, the family's ill luck, the curse of a fertility that brought forth only death, so that the dynasty that had filled the thrones of two kingdoms for generations died, at the last, in the empty cradle of its final queen. The Stuarts had begun in Scotland in the mists of the Middle Ages, and had reigned through glory and disaster for 300 years and more, and they ended in the worn and childless body of this sorrowful woman, who closed their long story with her own. Her childhood was shaped, above all, by the question that hung over her family, the question of religion, and by the strange decision that flowed from it. For her father had turned Catholic in a Protestant land, and her uncle the king, shrewd and far-seeing, understood the danger that lay in this, and he gave an order that was to determine the whole course of his nieces' lives. The two little daughters of the Catholic Duke, Mary and Anne, were to be taken from their father in the matter of their faith, and raised as firm and unquestioning Protestants in the Church of England, so that whatever happened to their father, the next generation of the royal line should be safe for the Protestant cause. And so the princess grew up devoted to the Church of England with a passion that never left her, attached to it heart and soul, more deeply and more simply pious than almost anyone around her, and her staunch and unwavering Protestantism would prove, in the end, one of the firmest foundations of her popularity and her throne. To understand how completely that faith took hold of her, one must remember the kind of religion it was that she was given, and the temper of the household of belief in which she was reared. The church she was raised in held a middle path, neither the bare austerity of the stricter reformers, nor the elaborate ceremony of Rome, but a sober and dignified worship of prayer book and surplice and ordered service, measured prayers said in the mother tongue and sermons of plain good sense. It suited her exactly, this grave and decent and unextravagant faith, asking of her no subtlety of doctrine that her plain mind could not follow, and no excess of fervour that her quiet nature shrank from, offering instead a settled framework of devotion, within which a simple and sincere soul could find rest. She loved its forms, knew its services by heart, drew from its prayers a comfort she found nowhere else, and the love of it grew with her until it was the very marrow of her being. There was besides a political dimension to her devotion that she came to understand as she grew, for in that age religion and loyalty were so woven together that to be a true daughter of the established church was to be a true friend of the crown and the constitution as well. The church she loved was the communion of the great majority of her future subjects, the faith bound up in their minds with all that was English and free and their own, set against the foreign and the Catholic and the tyrannical, and her own staunch adherence to it marked her out, from her girlhood, as the natural hope of all who dreaded a return of the old faith. Where her father's religion had made him an object of fear and suspicion, hers made her an object of trust and affection, the Protestant princess in whom the anxious nation could repose its hopes. So the decision taken in her childhood, that the daughter of a Catholic should be reared a firm Protestant, bore fruit far beyond what its authors can have foreseen, shaping not only her soul, but her whole public destiny. It gave her, first, the inward devotion that sustained her through a life of sorrow, the one sure refuge that never failed her, and it gave her, second, the public character that made her throne secure, the plain devout Englishness that her people loved. The two were one, in her the private and the public faith inseparable, and together they formed the bedrock on which everything else in her life was built. She was, before she was anything else, a daughter of her church, and she remained so to her dying breath, and it was the truest and the steadiest thing about her. The matter of religion, which shaped her childhood so decisively, was the deep dividing question of the age, the fault line that ran through the whole of her century, and along which all its earthquakes happened. England had broken with the Church of Rome more than 100 years before, and had become, in the generations since, a passionately and a suspiciously Protestant nation, with a deep and abiding dread of the old faith, and of the foreign powers that championed it. To most English people of that age, Roman Catholicism meant not merely a different way of worship, but a deadly political danger. The religion of the chief enemy powers across the Channel, the religion of plots and massacres and absolute kings, a thing to be feared and guarded against as a threat to English liberty and English lives. It was an age of fierce religious passion, and the passion ran all one way, towards a Protestantism that defined itself against the Catholic menace. Into this Protestant nation the princess's father brought the one thing it could not abide, a Catholic heir to the throne, for he had converted to the old faith and made no secret of it, and the prospect of a Catholic king filled the political nation with dread. It was the central crisis of the age, this fear of a popish successor, and it convulsed the politics of the country for years as men strove by every means to bar the Catholic heir from the throne or to bind him about with safeguards. And it was in the heart of this crisis that the decision was taken that shaped the princess's life. The decision that she and her sister, though their father was a Catholic, should be raised as staunch Protestants, as a kind of insurance for the Protestant cause, so that whatever befell their father the crown might yet pass to a Protestant of the royal blood. That upbringing took deeply, for the princess embraced the Church of England not as a mere political convenience, but as the very centre of her being, the thing she loved and trusted above all else in the world. Her Protestantism was not a calculation, but a passion simple and sincere and unshakable, and it became, in time, the firmest foundation of her throne, for it made her, in the eyes of her Protestant people, exactly the sovereign they wanted, one of their own in the deepest matter of all. Where her father had thrown his crown away for his faith, she would hold hers secure by hers. The same religious passion that had ruined the one preserved the other, and the daughter raised up as a Protestant safeguard against her Catholic father became, in the fullness of time, the Protestant queen who closed the door forever against his line. She was not a strong or a brilliant child. Her health was uncertain from the first, and her eyes troubled her so badly that as a small girl she was sent across the sea to France to the care of her grandmother, in the hope that the physicians there might do something for her sight, and though she came home again the trouble never wholly left her, and a weakness of the eyes, a perpetual half-blurring of the world, stayed with her all her life. Her education was narrow and shallow, as the education of princesses who were not expected to reign generally was, heavy on devotion and deportment, and the gentler accomplishments and light on everything else, so that she grew up knowing little of books or affairs and a deal of cards and needlework, and the proper conduct of a fine lady. She was shy and reserved and stubborn beneath the shyness, slow of speech and slow of thought, with none of the quick brilliance of the clever people around her. But there was in her a deep vein of feeling, a capacity for love and for loyalty and for grief that the cleverer people often lacked, and it was this, far more than any gift of mind, that would shape her life. The circumstances of her upbringing did little to draw out what gifts she had, for she was reared in the expectation that she would never reign, a younger daughter of a younger branch, and her schooling was shaped accordingly. The education thought fitting for a princess unlikely ever to wear a crown was a narrow and a shallow thing, long on the graces and short on the substance. A smattering of French, a little music, a deal of needlework and dancing and deportment, the catechism and the prayer book, the arts of moving and speaking and behaving as a fine lady should. Of history and letters and the workings of the world she was taught next to nothing, for no one supposed she would ever need to know them, and she grew up, in consequence, ill-furnished in mind for the high station that fate would one day thrust upon her, knowing far less of affairs than many a private gentleman's daughter. Oh, her troublesome eyes were a part of her childhood from the very first, and the memory of them stayed with her always. While still a small girl, she had been sent across the water to the care of her grandmother and to the hands of a noted physician of the eyes, in the hope that something might be done for a weakness of sight that already troubled her, and though the journey did her little lasting good, it gave her perhaps her earliest clear memories of a strange land and a foreign tongue, and the anxious business of being a sickly child far from home. The weakness never left her, and she went through life peering at a world she could not quite bring into focus, a circumstance that deepened, one may suppose, her natural shyness and her shrinking from the bright hard glare of the court. Out of all this, the narrow schooling and the poor sight, and the seclusion of the royal nursery, there was formed the grave, reserved, stubborn, devout character that she carried into her reign. She was shy to the point of pain, awkward among strangers, slow and hesitating in her speech, with a habit, when flustered, of falling back upon a few well-worn phrases. She was no talker, no wit, no shining ornament of the brilliant society into which she had been born. But beneath the timid surface there was laid down, in those quiet shadowed years, the deep foundation of her nature, the immovable obstinacy, the capacity for a profound and faithful love, the patient endurance, the simple unshakable piety. The girl was mother to the woman, and the woman who would one day be carried to a throne was already there, in the shy, short-sighted child bent over her needlework in the nursery, waiting for the years to bring her out. It is worth dwelling a little on the kind of person she was, for she was not at all the sort of person one expects to find at the centre of a glorious reign. She was, to begin with, genuinely not clever, in the bookish or the brilliant sense. Her education had been narrow, and her natural gifts were not of the intellectual kind, and she knew it and never pretended otherwise. She was slow of speech, with a habit of taking refuge when pressed in a few set phrases repeated over and over. She was awkward in company beyond her small circle, shy to the point of suffering, ill at ease with the clever and the witty who surrounded her. To the brilliant people of her court she seemed dull, and they did not always trouble to hide their opinion, and she felt the slight, and withdrew the further into her shell. But to mistake this dullness for stupidity, as her cleverer contemporary sometimes did, was itself a kind of stupidity, for beneath the slow and awkward surface there was a real shrewdness, a sound instinctive judgment of people and situations that the merely clever often lack. She knew her own mind, for all her slowness in expressing it, and she held to it with a stubbornness that her brilliant advisers found maddening. She could not be argued out of a settled conviction, and she had a way of seeming to yield while in fact giving nothing, of wearing down the impatient and the eloquent by sheer immovable persistence. And she had above all a deep steadiness of feeling, a capacity for loyalty and love, and a sense of duty so profound that it carried her, broken in body and crushed in spirit, through the heaviest burdens that can fall upon a human being. These were not the gifts that shine in a council chamber, but they were the gifts that hold a throne and win a people, and she had them in full measure. Her weak eyes were a part of her too, a small persistent affliction that coloured her whole experience of the world. From childhood her sight was poor, and it grew no better with the years, so that she moved through a world perpetually a little blurred and dim, peering at the faces and the papers before her, unable to see clearly the splendour over which she presided. It is a curious and a touching detail, this half-blindness of the queen of a brilliant age, as though she were fated to preside over a glory she could not quite make out. And it goes, somehow, with the rest of her, with the slowness and the shyness and the deep, sad patience, to make up the picture of a woman who was, in every way, a most unlikely centre for so much greatness, and who carried the weight of it, half-seeing and uncomplaining, to the end of her strength. The deepest attachment of her early years, and for a long time the ruling passion of her life, was not to any member of her own family, but to a girl a few years older than herself, a brilliant, beautiful, imperious girl named Sarah, who came to the court as an attendant and captured the shy princess's heart entirely. Sarah was everything that Anne was not, quick where Anne was slow, dazzling where Anne was dull, bold and witty and full of fire, and the quiet princess fell under her spell completely, conceiving for her elder friend an adoration that bordered on worship. It was the great friendship of Anne's life, intense and consuming, and on Anne's side at least, romantic in its devotion, and it would last for the better part of 40 years, and shape the whole of her reign, before it broke at last, as we shall see, in bitterness and grief. For the moment it was a pure delight to the lonely princess, a warmth and a brightness in a life that had little enough of either, and she gave herself to it with all the depth of her loving and undivided heart. So strong was the bond between them, and so much did Anne long to set it free from the awkwardness of their difference in rank, that the two friends fell into a charming pretense, agreeing to lay aside, when they were alone together, the titles and the formalities that stood between a princess and her servant. In their letters and their private hours, Anne was not the royal highness and Sarah not the humble attendant. They were simply two friends, two equals, and they took for themselves a pair of plain assumed names, so that Anne signed herself Mrs. Morley and called her companion Mrs. Freeman, and behind those homely names the princess could pour out her heart to the one person in the world she loved without reserve. It is a touching glimpse into the heart of a woman who would one day be a queen, this longing to be for a few hours no queen at all, but simply an equal among equals. And it tells us much about the loneliness of her grand position, that the great romance of her life should have been this hunger for an ordinary equal love. The friendship with Sarah deserves to be understood, for it was the ruling passion of the Queen's life until almost the end, and it is one of the most extraordinary relationships in the whole history of the English crown. It had begun when both were girls, the shy princess perhaps 8 or 9 and the dazzling Sarah a few years older, and from the first the quiet child was captivated by the brilliant one, drawn to everything in Sarah that she herself so conspicuously lacked. Sarah was beautiful, quick-tongued, fearless, overflowing with confidence and opinion and spirit, the very opposite of the slow and bashful princess, and the attraction of opposites bound them fast. To the lonely girl starved of the warmth her grand position denied her, Sarah was a revelation, a friend who was also a kind of hero, and she loved her with the whole force of a heart that had little else to pour itself into. The intensity of the bond, on the princess's side, went far beyond the ordinary friendships of young women, and the letters that survive between them speak a language of devotion almost like that of lovers, full of longing and jealousy and a craving for assurance of return. The princess could not bear the thought of any rival in Sarah's affection, fretted over every coolness, begged for letters and for visits and for proof that she was loved, and in her longing to dissolve the barrier of rank that lay between them, she devised the famous game of equal names, so that within their private world there should be no queen and no subject, only two friends on a level. It was a beautiful idea, and a revealing one, this hunger of a princess to be treated as an equal, to be loved for herself and not for her crown, but it carried within it the seed of future trouble, for it gave to the bold and domineering Sarah a license that she would, in time, fatally abuse. For there was, in the very nature of the friendship, an imbalance that boded ill, the imbalance between a princess who adored and a favourite who was adored. So long as both were young and the princess far from the throne, the equality was real enough, and the warmth flowed both ways. But the princess's love was always the deeper, her need the greater. And as the years went on and she rose towards the crown, the disparity between her devotion and Sarah's grew. Sarah came to take the adoration for granted, to presume upon it, to treat the friend who worshipped her with a careless and a high-handed familiarity that the princess long endured for love's sake, and the seeds of the bitter ending were sown in the very soil of that friendship, in the gap between the one who loved too much and the one who was loved more than she returned. But all that lay far in the future, for now there was only the warmth and the delight and the precious illusion of an equal love. In the summer of 1683, when she was 18, the princess was married, as princesses were, in a match arranged for reasons of state, to a foreign prince she had had no hand in choosing. Her husband was Prince George of Denmark, a large, placid, good-natured man some 12 years her senior, no genius and no hero, a prince of whom the witty people of the court made gentle fun, but a kind and faithful and undemanding husband, and the marriage, against all the odds of such arranged unions, turned into a genuine and lasting affection. He was not a man to set the world alight. A noted statesman who knew him remarked that he had tried him drunk and tried him sober, and found there was nothing in him either way, but he was devoted to his wife, and content to live quietly in her shadow, and she loved him with a steady, undramatic love, and leaned on him through all the sorrows that were to come. It was, by the standards of royal marriages, a happy one, and it gave her, if not brilliance or excitement, then something she valued more, a settled and a faithful companion for the long, hard road ahead. The marriage had been arranged, as royal marriages were, by others, and for reasons of state, with little regard for the wishes of the young woman whose life it would shape. A husband had to be found for the princess who was suitable in rank and sound in religion, and unlikely to entangle England in dangerous foreign quarrels, and the placid Protestant prince from Denmark fitted the requirements well enough, and so the match was made, and the princess was informed of her future as a matter already settled. It might have been a disaster, as so many such arranged unions were, a yoking together of two strangers with nothing in common but a treaty. That it turned out instead to be a quiet success was a piece of good fortune that the much-tried princess had richly earned. Nah, the prince, dull as the witty world found him, was exactly the husband her nature needed. He was kind, he was faithful, he was utterly without ambition or guile, content to live in his wife's shadow, and to ask nothing of her but her affection, and to a woman of her deep and anxious and loving temper, that steady, undemanding devotion was worth more than all the brilliance in the world. He shared her tastes, such as they were, the quiet domestic pleasures, the eating and the cards and the early nights. He shared, above all, her griefs, standing by her through the long succession of lost children with a patient sympathy that never failed. There were two ordinary, kindly, unspectacular people who happened to be a princess and a prince, and they made together exactly the kind of plain, affectionate marriage that two ordinary, kindly people might make, and it was the one unbroken comfort of her difficult life. The world laughed at him, of course, for he was an easy mark, slow and heavy, and given to a wheezing breathlessness, with no gift for the brilliant talk that the English court prized. The witty king, her uncle, made the cruel jest that he had tried the prince drunk and tried him sober, and could find nothing in him either way. But the princess did not want a wit or a hero. She wanted a companion she could trust and lean upon, and in the good dull prince she had found one, and she valued him at his true worth when the clever people could not. Through all the storms that were to break over her, the revolution and the quarrels and the endless griefs, he was there, solid and faithful and loving, and when at last she lost him, she was more alone than words can tell. It was no grand romance, this marriage, but it was a real one, and it gave her, through the hardest of lives, a refuge of ordinary human warmth. The quiet early years of her marriage were soon overtaken by the gathering crisis of her family's fortunes, the crisis that her father's religion had long been preparing. For her uncle the king died, and her father came to the throne as James II, a Catholic king of a Protestant people, and he set about, with a stubborn and fatal zeal, to advance his faith, and to gather power into his own hands, until he had frightened and angered almost the whole of the political nation. The country held its breath, hoping to endure him, for he was an aging man, and his heirs were his 2 Protestant daughters, and men told themselves that the trouble would pass with his death, and the Protestant succession would be safe. And then, in the summer of 1688, the thing happened that no one had bargained for, and that changed everything. For the king's second wife, his Catholic queen, gave birth to a son, a Catholic heir who would take precedence over his Protestant half-sisters and promise an unending line of Catholic kings. The brief and disastrous reign of her father is worth pausing on, for it was the hinge on which her whole fate turned. He had come to the throne on his brother's death, amid more goodwill than he had any right to expect, for the nation, weary of strife, was willing to give even a Catholic king a fair trial, trusting that his Protestant daughters would succeed him and the danger would pass. Had he been a man of any prudence, he might have reigned out his days in peace and handed on his crown intact. But prudence was the one thing he wholly lacked. He was a brave and an honest man in his way, but stubborn past all reason, rigid, tactless, and possessed by a burning zeal to advance his faith, and he set about the work with a recklessness that frightened and angered the whole political nation. He pushed his fellow Catholics into offices from which the law barred them, raised an army officered by them, claimed a royal power to set aside the laws of the land, and bore down with a heavy hand upon any who resisted him, until he had united against himself nearly every interest in the kingdom. The bishops of his own established church, the chief landowners, the lawyers, the merchants, the common people in the street, all watched with mounting alarm as the king drove forward his Catholic designs, and the trust with which his reign had begun curdled into fear and anger. Still men endured him, telling themselves it could not last, that the aging king would die and his Protestant daughter would set all to rights. The whole uneasy peace of his reign rested on the comfortable assurance that he had no Catholic son, and that the crown would pass when he was gone to the Protestant line. And then that assurance was swept away in an afternoon, for in the summer of his 3rd year upon the throne, his Catholic queen, against all expectation, was delivered of a son. At a stroke the whole calculation was overturned. There was now a Catholic heir who would take precedence over the Protestant princesses, and the prospect opened of not one Catholic reign, but an endless succession of them, a Catholic dynasty stretching away into the future. It was the one thing the nation would not bear, and the birth of that child, which should have been the crown of the king's hopes, was in fact the spark that destroyed him, for it turned the weary patience of his subjects into the resolve to be rid of him, and within a few months of his son's birth his throne was gone. The birth of that child was the spark that lit the revolution. So unwelcome was the news of a Catholic prince that many people simply refused to believe it, and a strange and ugly rumour ran through the land that the child was no true child of the king and queen at all, but an impostor smuggled into the royal bed in a warming pan to furnish the Catholics with their heir. The rumour was almost certainly false, a piece of desperate wishful thinking, but it was widely and eagerly believed, and the princess herself, to her later discredit, lent it her countenance, writing of her doubts that the child was truly her brother, for she had no love for her Catholic stepmother, and every reason of religion and ambition to wish the little prince away. And when, that autumn, her sister's Protestant husband, William of Orange, landed in England at the head of an army to drive her father out and save the Protestant cause, the princess did not stand by her father but went over, with hardly a backward glance, to the side of his enemies. The revolution that followed was so swift and so nearly bloodless that men marvelled at it, and called it, in their relief, a thing almost miraculous. The Protestant champion to whom the nation turned was the princess's own brother-in-law, the cold and capable Dutch prince who had married her elder sister, and who watched the affairs of England with a keen eye, for he was the chief enemy of the mighty Catholic King of France, and needed England on his side. Invited by the leading men of the kingdom, he gathered an army and a fleet, and crossed the sea in the autumn winds, and landed in the west of England, and advanced slowly towards London, and as he came the king's whole position simply melted away beneath him. The army would not fight for the king. The chief men deserted him one by one. Even his own family fell away, and the wretched king found himself abandoned by nearly everyone he had trusted. Among those who abandoned him were his daughters, and the princess's own desertion was one of the bitterest drops in his cup. As her brother-in-law advanced and her father's cause crumbled, she slipped away from the court by night, down a back staircase, and fled to the camp of her father's enemies, throwing in her lot with the revolution against her own parent. It was the act of a frightened young woman caught in a terrible collision of loyalties, religion, and family pulling against each other, and she chose her religion and her future over her father. But however one judges it, it was a hard thing for a father to bear, the flight of his own child to the side of those who were driving him from his throne. The broken king, learning that even his daughters had forsaken him, is said to have cried out in his anguish at the unkindness of his own flesh and blood. In the end the king, his nerve broken and his cause lost, fled the country altogether, and his going was taken as an abdication, and the throne was declared vacant, and the princess's sister and brother-in-law were invited to fill it as joint sovereigns. So the revolution was accomplished, and the Catholic king was gone, and the Protestant succession was saved, and the nation congratulated itself on a deliverance achieved with so little blood. But for the princess there was a private reckoning beneath the public rejoicing, for she had bought her share in the new order at the price of her father, and the knowledge of it would not leave her. She had done, perhaps, what the safety of her religion and her country required, but she had done it to her own father, and that was not a thing that even the most necessary of revolutions could quite wash clean. It was the great betrayal of her life, and it cost her something, whatever her convictions, for when the crisis came and her father's cause collapsed about him, and he fled the country a broken man, it was in part his own daughters who had abandoned him. Her sister Mary came over from Holland to take the throne jointly with her husband, and the princess fell into her place in the new order, third in the line behind the childless royal couple, and the Protestant succession was secured, and her father was an exile, and the thing was done. She had chosen her religion over her father, and her future over her loyalty, and though the choice was perhaps the right one for the country, it was not a thing to be proud of, and there is reason to think that in later years, when sorrow had softened her, the memory of how she had used her father lay heavy on her conscience. The fate of the father she had abandoned was a sad one, and it cannot have made her memory of her own part any easier to bear. He fled across the sea to the protection of the mighty Catholic King of France, who received him kindly and gave him a palace and a pension and the empty honours of a king in exile, and there he lived out his remaining years, a broken and a melancholy figure, brooding on his fall and dreaming of a restoration that never came. He made one attempt to win back his crown, landing in Ireland and gathering an army of his Catholic subjects there, but he was defeated in a pitched battle by his son-in-law and driven back into exile. And after that there was nothing left for him but to wait in his French refuge for death. He turned in his last years to religion, to a deep and penitential piety, and seemed to find in it some peace, and he died at last in exile, far from the throne he had thrown away, leaving his claim to his young son, the child whose birth had triggered his fall. For the princess, now risen to be a queen herself, the existence of that exiled family across the water was a perpetual reproach and a perpetual danger. Her father was dead, but his son lived, her own half-brother, the Catholic prince whom his followers held to be the rightful king, and his presence in the world was a standing reminder of how she and her sister had come by their thrones. She had supported the rumour that he was no true child of her father's. She had fled to the enemies of her own parent. She had, in the eyes of those who kept the old loyalty, helped to usurp a crown that was not hers. The charge was not one she could easily refute, for there was truth in it, and as she grew older and sorrow softened her, the memory of how she had used her father seems to have weighed upon her with a growing heaviness. There were those who believed that in her last years, childless and ailing and conscious that her line would die with her, she came to feel the wrong she had done her father as a kind of curse upon her house, and that the long martyrdom of her lost children was in her own troubled imagination a punishment for that ancient betrayal. Whether she truly thought so we cannot know, for she was not a woman who opened her heart readily even to those closest to her, but it would have been in keeping with her deep and anxious piety, her sense of a God who watched and judged, to read her sufferings as a reckoning. She had gained a throne by deserting a father, and she had then been stripped, one by one, of every child who might have inherited it, and a mind as devout and as guilt-prone as hers may well have traced a line between the two, and found in her endless griefs the heavy hand of a justice she dared not question. The reign of her sister and her brother-in-law was not, for the princess, a happy time, for she did not love the cold and distant Dutchman who now sat on the throne, and her once close bond with her sister soured into a bitter estrangement. The cause of the quarrel was above all her friend Sarah, for the new king and queen had come to distrust the brilliant, grasping, domineering favourite and the ambitious soldier she had married, and they pressed the princess again and again to put her friend away. But the princess would not give up her Sarah for anyone, not for a king, not for a queen, not for her own sister. She clung to her friend with a stubborn and absolute loyalty, defying the whole weight of the crown rather than part with the one person she loved best in the world. And the defiance opened a breach between the royal sisters that never healed. They quarrelled and were estranged, and ceased at last even to speak. And when her sister the queen died, still young, of the smallpox, in the winter of 1694, the two had not been reconciled, and the princess was left with the grief of a sister lost beyond the reach of any apology, and the knowledge that the breach would now never be mended in this world. The years of her sister's reign were, for the princess, a long and a galling trial, for she found herself in the worst of positions, a person of the highest rank and the nearest blood, with no real power and no real freedom, watched and distrusted, and hedged about with constraints. She did not like her brother-in-law, the cold, reserved Dutchman who now ruled, and he did not like her, and between the two there was a chilly mutual dislike that poisoned the whole atmosphere of her life. She felt herself slighted, kept short of money and of consequence, treated as a subject rather than as the heir to the throne she now was, and she nursed her grievances, as people without power will, and grew sullen and resentful under the daily small humiliations of her position. The great quarrel, the one that broke her bond with her sister past mending, was over her friend Sarah, whom the king and queen had come to regard with a deep and not unreasonable distrust. They saw in the brilliant, ambitious favourite and her scheming soldier husband a dangerous influence over the heir to the throne, a focus for discontent and intrigue, and they pressed the princess again and again to dismiss her, to put the troublesome favourite out of her household and her life. But the princess would not, could not, give up her Sarah. The friendship was the deepest thing in her, dearer to her than the goodwill of any king or queen, and she set her face against them all with the immovable stubbornness that was her deepest trait, choosing her friend over her sister, her heart over her interest, with a defiance that astonished everyone who knew her usual timidity. The quarrel poisoned the last years of the two sisters' lives, and it was never made up. They had been close once, the two motherless girls raised together, but the breach over Sarah, widening into a general estrangement, drove them apart until they ceased to meet or to speak, two queens-to-be living in the same small world and passing each other in a frozen silence. And then, suddenly, the chance of reconciliation was gone forever, for the elder sister, the queen, was struck down by the smallpox in the prime of her life and died within a few days, and the quarrel was sealed by death, unhealed, and now unhealable. The princess grieved as one grieves for what can never be set right. She had lost not only a sister, but the possibility of ever making peace with her, and the knowledge that they had parted in coldness, and that no word of reconciliation would ever now be spoken, was a sorrow she carried with so many others for the rest of her days. And running through all these years, beneath the politics and the quarrels and the shifting fortunes of her family, there was a private and a far deeper sorrow, the sorrow that would mark her more than any other, and that gives her story its peculiar and heartbreaking character. For the princess was almost constantly with child, season upon season, through the whole of her marriage, and almost none of her children lived. She conceived again and again with a regularity that is painful even to read of across the centuries, and pregnancy after pregnancy ended in disaster, in the stillbirth or the miscarriage, or the death within hours or days or months of the longed-for child. She bore this private martyrdom with a patient and uncomplaining fortitude that wrings the heart, taking each fresh loss as the will of the God she so devoutly served, and trying again and losing again, while her health broke slowly under the strain of it, and the hope of an heir flickered and dimmed and would not quite go out. It is the long tragedy of her childbearing more than anything else that sets her story apart, for there is scarcely a parallel to it in the annals of any throne, and it is hard to contemplate even now without a deep pity. Through the whole of her marriage she was with child, and time after time the hope ended in sorrow, in a child born dead, or a child that lived a few hours or days or weeks and then was gone, or a hope that failed before its time. She conceived more than a dozen times, perhaps as many as 17 or 18, and out of all those expectations only a handful of children were ever born alive, and out of that handful only one lived past earliest infancy, and even he was taken from her before he grew up. It was a martyrdom drawn out across 16 years, a slow procession of cradles and coffins, and she walked through it with a patience that breaks the heart. We do well to pause here, and to look at this long sorrow not as a line in a chronicle, but as the lived experience of a woman, for it is too easily passed over in a sentence, and it was the central tragedy of her life. Each had been a real child longed for, prepared for, prayed over. Each time the nursery had been made ready, the small clothes laid by, the whole household lifted into expectation, and each time, or very nearly each time, The expectation had ended in a still and silent grief, a hope carried almost to its fulfillment and then, at the last, taken away. To bear such a loss once is a heavy thing, to bear it again and again and again across the years, always hoping and always losing, is a trial of the spirit that few are ever asked to undergo, and she underwent it with a fortitude that asks our reverence. What she felt in the long watches of those griefs we can only dimly guess, for she was not a woman who wore her heart open, and she left no record of her inmost sorrow, but we may be sure it went deep, in a nature so capable of love and so hungry for the family she was never granted. She wanted children with her whole soul, would have asked nothing better of life than a houseful of them about her, and the cruelty of her fate was precisely that it gave her the bearing of children without the keeping of them, the pain of motherhood without its lasting joy. Year upon year she paid the full price and was denied the reward, and the wonder is not that her health and spirits sank under it, but that she kept on hoping at all, kept on offering herself to the same ordeal in the same faith, that this time, perhaps, the child would live. Her faith was, in truth, the secret of her endurance, for she met each loss not with rebellion, but with submission, bowing to a providence whose purposes she did not pretend to understand, and trusting that a wisdom higher than her own had ordered even this. It was a hard creed that taught her to see the hand of God in the emptying of her cradle, and there were perhaps moments when it must have strained almost to breaking, but it held, and it carried her through, and it gave her griefs a quiet dignity that mere stoicism could never have lent them. She did not rage and she did not despair. She grieved and submitted, and hoped again, and the long patient bearing of an almost unbearable sorrow is, in the end, the truest measure of her soul, and the deepest claim she has upon the tenderness of those who come after. We should be careful, across the centuries, not to reduce this to a mere catalogue of numbers, for behind every one of those lost pregnancies was a living hope and a real grief, a child longed for and prepared for and then mourned. Each time she would hope again, for she was a woman who wanted children with her whole soul, who would have asked nothing better of life than a nursery full of them, and each time the hope would be dashed, and she would gather herself and grieve, and in time begin again. The physical toll of it was terrible, the endless cycle of pregnancy and loss wearing down a constitution never strong to begin with, so that she was old before her time, worn and ill and lame while still a relatively young woman, and the toll upon her spirit can only be guessed at, the slow accumulation of grief upon grief upon grief. She bore it by every account with an extraordinary and an uncomplaining fortitude, the fortitude of her deep and simple faith, which taught her to see in each loss the inscrutable will of a God whose purposes she did not question. She did not rage or despair. She submitted and endured, and tried again with a quiet, dogged courage that asked for no pity and made no parade of its pain. There is a heroism in that quiet endurance, a strength of a kind that the world does not often celebrate, the strength to suffer the same blow again and again and to keep faith and keep going. And it is the truest measure of the woman, this patient bearing of an almost unbearable sorrow, far truer than all the glory that gathered around her throne. The hope of an heir of her body flickered through all those years, and dimmed with each fresh loss, and would not quite go out until the very last of her many trials had failed. There was, in the midst of all this loss, one great exception, one child who lived, and into him the princess poured all the hope and all the love that her many sorrows had dammed up in her heart. He was a boy, born in the summer of 1689, and he was given the title of Duke of Gloucester, and against all the odds that had carried off his brothers and sisters, he survived his infancy and grew into a bright and engaging child, the one living promise that his mother's line might continue after all. He was the darling of the nation as well as of his mother, the promise of the Protestant succession made flesh, a quick and lively boy fond of soldiers and drilling and all things military, who kept a little troop of boy soldiers and played at being a general. But he was never strong. Some trouble of the head, some gathering of water upon the brain, gave him an overlarge head and an unsteady gait, and marked him, to the anxious eyes that watched him, as a child who might not be meant for a long life. The little Duke of Gloucester, the one child who lived, became the focus of an attention and an affection out of all proportion even to his rank, for he was not merely a prince but a symbol, the living proof that his mother's line might yet continue and the Protestant succession be secured through her own blood. The whole nation watched over his health with anxious tenderness, and his mother hovered over him with a devotion sharpened almost to terror by all the children she had already lost, for in this one frail boy were gathered up all the longing that so many little graves had disappointed. He was a winning child, by all accounts bright and forward, and full of spirit, with a precocious love of all things military that delighted the age, and he gathered about himself a small troop of boys whom he drilled and marched and commanded as his own miniature army, playing at the soldiering that his mother's reign would one day make so glorious. But the shadow of ill health lay over him from the first, and the watchful eyes that loved him could not but see it. He had suffered, it seems, from some affliction of the brain from infancy, a gathering of water within the skull that gave his head an unusual size and his movements an unsteadiness, so that he could not climb a stair without help and tired easily, and was never quite like other children. The physicians of that age could do little for such a condition, but watch it, and the people who loved him watched and hoped, and told themselves that he would outgrow his weakness and live to be the strong king his mother's line so badly needed. There was a brittleness about him, for all his brightness, that the anxious could not quite ignore. Still he lived year after year, where all his brothers and sisters had died, and as he grew from infancy into boyhood, the hope hardened into something like confidence, the sense that this child, against all the odds, had been spared. His mother allowed herself to believe it, to plan for his future, to see in him the heir who would carry on her line and her cause. And the nation, too, fixed its hopes on the bright soldier boy who would one day be king. It is this, the long reprieve, the years of hope rewarded, that makes what followed so cruel, for the blow, when it fell, did not fall upon a family already braced for it, but upon a mother who had at last let herself believe that this one child of all her children was safe. The brittle, bright, beloved boy had carried his mother's whole heart on his frail shoulders for 11 years, and she had come to lean her future upon him, and that was the measure of what she lost when he was taken. And so it proved, in the cruelest possible way, for the boy lived just long enough to let his mother believe that he was safe, and then was taken from her. A few days after his 11th birthday, in the summer of 1700, the young Duke of Gloucester fell suddenly ill of a fever and a sore throat, and within a few days he was dead, and the last and dearest dream of his mother's heart was gone. It is hard to imagine the weight of that blow falling upon a woman who had already lost so many children, who had borne it all in the faith that this one at least had been spared to her, and who now found that he too was taken, and that all her long martyrdom of childbearing had come, in the end, to nothing. With the death of her one surviving child, the princess's hope of an heir of her body was at an end, and she knew it. She was past the age when she could reasonably look for another such child, and the worn and grieving woman understood that whatever might happen to the crown, it would not now pass to a son of hers. The suddenness of it was part of the cruelty. He had passed his 11th birthday only a few days before, and there had been festivities for it, and he had seemed well enough. And then, The swiftness that carried off so many children in that age of helpless medicine, he sickened of a fever and a throat infection, and within a handful of days he was dead. The physicians gathered and bled him and dosed him, and did in all likelihood more harm than good, for the medicine of the time was a blundering and a brutal business. But nothing they could do made any difference, and the boy slipped away, and the long hope of his mother's heart died with him. One can hardly imagine the scene. The mother who had buried so many infants now watching her one surviving child, her 11-year-old, the prop of all her hopes, carried off before her eyes, and powerless to save him. For the princess, it was the heaviest blow of a life that had known so many, the loss that broke something in her that never quite mended. She had endured the deaths of her babies with the fortitude of her faith, telling herself that they had been too young to lose, that there might yet be others, but this was different. This was the child who had lived, the one who had been spared, the future made flesh, and his death closed a door that could not be opened again. She was past her middle 30s now, worn and ill, and she knew with a bleak certainty that there would be no more children, that the boy she had just buried had been her last hope of an heir of her own body. The martyrdom of her childbearing had come, in the end, to exactly nothing. She had borne and lost a whole nursery of children, and not one was left. She withdrew into a deep and a private grief, and those who saw her in the months that followed found her sunk in a settled melancholy from which she only slowly and partially emerged. The reign that lay ahead of her, the glory and the greatness, was still to come, but she came to it as a woman who had already lost the thing she had most wanted in the world, who had been stripped of the hope of seeing her own child succeed her, and who knew that whatever she might achieve upon the throne, her own line would die with her. It is worth holding this firmly in mind as we turn to the splendours of her reign, for the woman who presided over them carried always beneath the robes of state this central and incurable sorrow, the knowledge that all the glory in the world could not give her back her child, nor fill the empty place where her hope of the future had been. The death of the young prince was not only a private grief, but a public crisis of the first order, for it left the Protestant succession hanging by a thread. The king, her brother-in-law, was childless and ailing. The princess herself, after the loss of her boy, was without an heir, and beyond the two of them there stretched a barren prospect, with the crown likely to pass when they were gone, in a doubt and danger, and the exiled Catholic line across the water, waiting and watching for its chance to return. Something had to be done, and quickly, to settle the succession beyond dispute and to bar the door forever against a Catholic restoration. And so the Parliament set itself to the task and produced, in 1701, the weighty measure known as the Act of Settlement, which was to fix the descent of the crown for all the generations to come. The solution it found reached far afield, passing over the whole nearer Catholic kin of the royal house, a long line of cousins with better blood claims, to settle the succession, after the princess herself, upon a distant Protestant relative in Germany, an elderly electress of the small state of Hanover, who was a granddaughter of the first Stuart king, and upon her descendants forever. It was an extraordinary thing to do, to hand the ancient crown of England across the sea to a family of German princes few in England had ever heard of, and to do it for no better reason than their Protestantism. But Protestantism was reason enough in that fearful age, and the Act of Settlement was passed, and the Hanoverian succession was written into the law of the land. The princess, who would have to live with it, accepted it as the necessary safeguard of the faith she held dearer than anything. But it was a strange and a melancholy thing for her to contemplate, that the crown she would soon wear would pass, at her death, not to any child of hers, but to strangers from a foreign land, and that she would be, when her time came, the last of her own great line. The law that did this was no simple naming of an heir, but a charter of conditions, hedging the crown about with new restrictions that marked how far the monarchy had travelled from the old idea of unfettered kingship. The sovereign who should come after must be a member of the established church, bound to it by law and unable to be otherwise. No Catholic, and none married to a Catholic, could ever wear the crown, and the door was shut and bolted against the old faith for all time to come. There were other clauses too, drawn up with the foreign succession in mind, that the nation should not be dragged into wars for the defence of the new line's German dominions without the consent of its parliament, and that the judges should hold their places by good behaviour, and not at the king's mere pleasure. For the men who framed the law were resolved that the crown they were handing to strangers should be a crown bound by rules, not a free gift of absolute power. It was in its way as weighty a measure as any in the nation's history, for it fixed not only who should reign, but on what terms, and it set the seal upon the principle that even the throne itself stood beneath the law. The princess upon whom the law now fixed the future of the crown was a woman already past her 70th year, the ruler's widow of a small North German state, chosen for one reason and one alone, that she was the nearest Protestant in the long tangle of the royal descent. She was a granddaughter of the first king of the Stuart line to rule in England, through that king's daughter, a spirited princess who had married a German prince and reigned briefly and unluckily over a far country before ending her days in exile, and through this thread, slender but Protestant, the crown of England was now to pass. To reach her, the law leaped clean over a whole host of nearer kin, some 50 persons and more who stood closer in blood to the throne, but who laboured under the one fatal disqualification of the Roman faith. Cousins and second cousins by the score, with claims far better than hers in mere descent, were struck out of the reckoning at a stroke. It was descent filtered through religion, a succession settled not by blood alone, but by blood and creed together, and is set upon the throne, in the fullness of time, a line that no one would have dreamed of but for the overmastering English dread of a Catholic king. There was something both bold and strange in this, the deliberate choice of a nation to fetch its future kings from a foreign land rather than risk a sovereign of the wrong religion, and it marked a profound change in the very idea of the monarchy. A crown that could be settled this way passed over the heads of the rightful heirs, and handed to distant Protestants by a vote of Parliament, was no longer quite the sacred hereditary thing it had been. It had become, in part, a trust held on conditions, a public office with a religious test attached. The princess accepted it, for it secured the cause she held dearest, but it must have been a melancholy thing for her to reflect that the crown she would shortly wear was to pass at her death, not to her own flesh and blood, but to strangers from across the sea, and that she herself, the daughter of an ancient line of kings, was to be the last of her house to reign. Her time came soon enough. In the early spring of 1702, the king, her brother-in-law, was thrown from his horse when it stumbled on a molehill, and the fall, trifling in itself, proved too much for his frail and failing body, and within a few days he was dead. And so the long apprenticeship of grief and waiting was over, and the shy, ailing, much bereaved princess, now a woman of 37 worn before her time by sorrow and ill health, became Queen of England and Scotland and Ireland, the last of the Stuart line to hold the throne. She came to her crowning, as we have seen, carried in a chair, too lame and ill to walk, but beneath the broken body there was a steady and a dutiful spirit, a deep love of her country and her church, and a quiet determination to be a good queen to her people, and the reign that now began, against every expectation, was to be one of the most brilliant in the history of the realm. Her accession came about through one of those small accidents that turn the course of history, for the king, her brother-in-law, riding in his park, was thrown when his horse stumbled on a molehill, and the fall broke his collarbone, and the injury, trifling in a healthy man, proved fatal to his frail and asthmatic frame. Within a few days he was dead, and the princess, who had waited so long in the cold shadow of his reign, was queen at last. There is an irony, savoured by her enemies and her friends alike, in the smallness of the cause. The cold king brought down by a molehill, and the long-slighted princess raised to the throne by the stumble of a horse, and the Jacobites who hated the whole revolution settlement would, for years afterward, drink a sly toast to the little gentleman in black velvet, meaning the mole whose handiwork had killed the Dutch king. She came to her crown a sad and an ailing woman, born before her time, and the contrast between her broken body and the splendour of her new estate struck everyone who saw her. She was not yet 40, but the years of childbearing and grief and illness had aged her cruelly, and she was lame with the gout that would torment the rest of her life, and so heavy and so racked with pain that she could not stand through the long ceremony of her crowning, nor walk the processional way, but had to be carried to her own coronation in an open chair. It was a strange and a touching spectacle, this stout, lame, half-blind, sorrowful woman being borne to the throne of a mighty kingdom, and it seemed to promise little. Few who watched her carried past would have guessed at the greatness that her reign would bring. And yet beneath the unpromising exterior there was much that fitted her for her high place, more than her cleverer contemporaries gave her credit for. She had a deep and genuine love of her country, a conscientious devotion to her duty, a sound instinct for the temper of her people, and above all a quality her brilliant predecessor had wholly lacked, the quality of being English to the bone, one of her own people in blood and faith and feeling. After years of being ruled by a cold foreigner who never troubled to hide his preference for his own land, the nation found in its new queen something it had missed, a sovereign who was wholly and simply English, who loved what they loved and believed what they believed, and they took her to their hearts for it. The reign that began with a woman carried to her crowning in a chair would prove, against every expectation, one of the most brilliant in the long history of the realm, and much of its success was owed to the plain English virtues of the unpromising woman in the chair. The new queen brought to her throne a character that was, in its quiet way, well suited to the moment. She was no genius, and she knew it. She had none of the dazzling cleverness of the brilliant figures of her age, and she leaned heavily, all her reign, upon the ministers and the favourites who served her. But she had qualities that served her people better than mere brilliance might have done. She was honest, dutiful, and deeply, simply English, the first wholly English sovereign in living memory after a Dutchman and a line of half-foreign kings, and the nation warmed to her for it. In her first speech to her parliament she declared, in a phrase that went straight to the hearts of her subjects, that her own heart was entirely English, and they believed her and loved her for it. She was devout above all, attached to the Church of England with her whole soul, and she made the welfare of that church the first care of her reign, founding a fund out of her own revenues for the relief of the poorer clergy that bears her name to this day. Her devotion to the Church of England was the deepest and steadiest passion of her life, the fixed point around which everything else turned, and has shaped her conduct as a queen at every step. She loved it not as a political institution merely, but as the very household of her faith, the source of all her comfort in a life of sorrow, and she made its welfare the first care of her reign, watching over its interests, defending its privileges, and filling its high offices, so far as she was able, with men after her own devout and moderate heart. She attended its services with a faithful regularity, took its sacraments as the chief consolation of her griefs, and ordered her whole life by its calendar and its teaching, and her people, themselves overwhelmingly attached to that same communion, loved her the more for a piety that was so evidently sincere. Her religion was not a thing of show or of theological subtlety, for she had no head for the fine points of doctrine and no taste for display. It was a plain, deep, heartfelt attachment, the religion of a simple and a suffering soul that found in the faith its only sure refuge. It gave her, through all her trials, a fortitude that nothing could break, the strength to bear loss upon loss without complaint, to submit to a providence she did not understand, to keep her footing on the hard road that her days had become. And it gave her too a kind of moral authority with her people, that all her bodily weakness could not diminish, for they saw in her a sovereign who genuinely feared God and loved his church. Her care for the church showed itself in deeds as well as in devotion, and some of them left a lasting mark upon the land. In the swelling suburbs of her capital, where the people had multiplied faster than the old parishes could serve them, she set on foot a scheme for the building of many new churches, so that the poor of the spreading city should not be left without the offices of religion, and a number of handsome new churches rose in consequence, several of which stand to this day. She watched with a jealous eye over the appointments to the bishoprics and the richer livings, preferring, where she could, men of a moderate and a kindly stamp after her own heart, neither fiery zealots nor cold worldlings, but sober shepherds of the sort she thought her people best served by. And she kept the solemn days of the calendar with a faithful exactness, above all the yearly fast in memory of her martyred ancestor, the king who had perished upon the scaffold 2 generations before. In these things she was wholly in her element, the most diligently devout of all the sovereigns of her age, ordering the affairs of the church she loved with the same patient conscientiousness she brought to every other duty of her crown. There was about her, too, a strain of the old sacred majesty of kingship that was already passing out of the world, and she was the last English sovereign to practice one of its most ancient rites. For it had been believed for centuries that the touch of an anointed monarch could cure a certain disease of the skin and glands that was known, for that reason, as the king's evil, and the sufferers would come in their crowds to be touched by the royal hand, and to receive the healing they believed it could bestow. The Queen revived this ancient ceremony and performed it faithfully, laying her hands upon the sick who were brought before her, and among the children she touched, in one of the famous small coincidences of history, was a sickly infant from the Midlands, who would grow up to be one of the greatest writers of the following age. She was the last to do it. The rite died with her, dismissed by the cooler temper of the times that followed as a piece of outworn superstition. But it tells us something of the woman, and of the age just ending, that the ailing queen should have reached back to so old and so sacred an idea of what a monarch was. The custom was older than memory, and it was not England's alone, for the kings of France across the water claimed the self-same gift, and the rival monarchies had long disputed which of them held the healing virtue by the better right. So settled a part of the sacred furniture of kingship was it, that a special form of service had been drawn up for it and printed in the prayer book of the church with its appointed lessons and prayers, so that the touching was no rough folk charm but a solemn office of religion, ordered and dignified and performed before the altar. The numbers who came were very large, for the malady was common, and the faith in the cure was strong, and a sovereign might lay hands in a single 12-month upon many hundreds of the afflicted, each going away with a small gold token hung about the neck, and a hope of healing in the heart. Not everyone believed even then. There were skeptics and physicians who shook their heads and muttered of coincidence and credulity, and the cooler spirits of the rising age looked upon the whole business as a relic of a darker time. But the Queen believed, with the simple, unquestioning faith that was the centre of her nature, and her people in their multitudes believed with her, and so long as that faith endured, the sick came and were touched, and went away comforted. She stood, in truth, at the very close of an old way of being a king, and the laying on of hands was only the most picturesque of several ancient powers that quietly fell out of use with her. She was the last of her line, for one thing, ever to refuse her assent to a measure that the two Houses of Parliament had passed, exercising in her own person that old royal veto upon the making of laws which her successors would never afterward dare to use. After her, no sovereign would ever again say no to a bill that Parliament had sent up, and the power, though it was never abolished, simply withered from neglect. In a dozen such ways her reign marked the boundary between the older monarchy, still personal and active and clothed in something of the sacred, and the newer kind that was coming, in which the sovereign would reign, but leave more and more of the ruling to others. She was not aware, of course, of standing upon any such boundary. She did her duty as she had always understood it, weighing the bills and keeping the old observances as her fathers had done before her. But the world was shifting under her feet, and the things she did as a matter of course would seem, to the very next generation, the quaint usages of a vanished time, and she was, in this as in so much else, the last of an old order, as well as the last of an old line. For the ceremony died with her. Her successors, the practical German kings who came after, would have nothing to do with so superstitious a rite, and the touching for the king's evil, after centuries of practice, simply ceased. And there is a kind of symbolic fitness in that the old sacred idea of monarchy should have made its last appearance in the reign of the last Stuart, and died with the dynasty that had clung most fiercely to the sacredness of the crown. She was, in this as in so much else, a figure standing at the very end of an old order, the last to embody an idea of kingship that reached back to the Middle Ages, the idea of the monarch as a sacred and a half-divine person, set apart by God. And when she laid her hands for the last time upon the sick, and when she died, that ancient idea, already fading, passed quietly out of the living practice of the English crown. The towering figure of her reign, and for many years the master of her councils, was the husband of her beloved Sarah, the soldier John Churchill, whom she raised to be Duke of Marlborough and set at the head of her armies. He was one of the supreme commanders in the history of war, a general of cool and far-seeing genius who never fought a battle he did not win, nor besieged a town he did not take, and the Queen, in entrusting her forces to him, gave her reign the instrument of its glory. For years the Queen, the Duke, and the Duchess formed a kind of ruling partnership, the shy sovereign leaning upon the brilliant soldier and his brilliant wife. The three of them bound together by the long, intimate friendship of the two women, and so long as that partnership held, it carried all before it, and the arms of Britain went from triumph to triumph across the fields of Europe. The friendship of Anne and Sarah, the romance of the lonely princess's youth, had grown into one of the central political facts of the age, and the favour of the Queen had made the fortune of the House of Marlborough. It is worth understanding just how completely the soldier and the sovereign were bound together in the great enterprise of the war, for the one could not have done what he did without the steady backing of the other. She made him Captain General of her armies, the supreme commander of all her forces on land, and she sustained him in that command, year after year, against every gust of envy and faction at home, so that he could fight his campaigns abroad with the assurance that his mistress stood behind him. Beside the two of them, there stood a third, the cool and capable lord, who served as treasurer of the realm and managed its money and its politics, and the three together, the general, the treasurer, and the queen, formed the firm centre upon which the whole vast effort of the war was built. While the lords debated and the parties wrangled, that small group held the nation steady to its purpose and saw the long struggle through to victory. The shape of those years settled into a kind of rhythm that governed the life of the court and the nation alike. Each spring the general crossed the narrow sea to the Low Countries to gather the allied armies and open the season's campaigning. Through the summer the fighting went forward, with its marches and its sieges and now and then its great pitched battle, and each autumn, as the roads turned to mud and the armies went into their winter quarters, he came home to render his account and to plan the next year's work. At home the queen waited, as wives and mothers across her kingdom waited for the slow news from the front, for the couriers who came spurring with word of a town taken or a battle joined. And when the news was good, she gave thanks for it with a fervour that was wholly genuine, and when it was bad she bore it with the patience she had learned in a harder school than war. For the general's wars were, to her, not merely matters of state, but matters of the heart, since the man who fought them was the husband of the friend she loved best in all the world. His victories were the triumphs of her own household, his dangers the dangers of one bound to her by the closest ties, and she followed his campaigns with an anxious personal interest that no mere minister could have commanded. It gave the public struggle a strange intimacy, this knitting together of the war abroad and the friendships of the court at home, and it meant that the glory the general won was, in a manner, the glory of the Queen's own affections, the harvest of the long devotion that had ruled her life since she was a girl. For a while, in those bright years of victory, the public triumph and the private love ran together in a single golden current, before the one outlasted the other, and the friendship failed while the fame endured. The Duke of Marlborough, who was to be the instrument of all this glory, was one of the most remarkable men of his age, and one of the most complicated. He had risen from no very lofty beginnings by a combination of charm, ability, and a cool, unscrupulous attention to his own advancement, serving and deserting masters as his interest dictated, until his enemies could fairly call him a man who had betrayed every cause he ever served. He had owed his early rise in part to the favour of the princess's father, and had then abandoned that father in the Revolution, as so many did. He was grasping about money, careful of his own skin in the political quarrels of the day, and never quite to be trusted by anyone who looked to him for loyalty above interest. In all this he was a thorough man of his time, and not an especially admirable one, but set him at the head of an army, and all the pettiness fell away, and there emerged one of the supreme military geniuses in the history of the world. He had a grasp of war complete and effortless, an eye that took in at a glance the whole of a battlefield or a campaign, a coolness in the heat of action that nothing could ruffle, and a gift for managing men, allies, supplies, and politics together that no other commander of the age could match. He never lost a battle. He never failed in a siege. He held together, by sheer force of tact and will, a fractious alliance of jealous powers that would have flown apart under any lesser hand. The soldiers worshipped him, and called him affectionately by a homely nickname, for beneath the cool exterior there was a real care for the men he led, and they trusted him to spend their lives only when he must, and to win with them when he could. It was upon this man, the husband of her dearest friend, that the Queen heaped honours such as no subject of hers had known until he stood the foremost man in the kingdom and one of the most celebrated in Europe. She made him a duke, and loaded him with the chief offices of the army, the supreme command of her forces and the mastery of her ordnance besides. The grateful emperor abroad raised him higher still, to be a prince of the old empire of the Germans, with the small principality of his own among its 100 states, so that the soldier who had begun as a plain gentleman's son ended girt about with titles from half the courts of the continent. He had his enemies, of course, and no small number of them, for such a height of fortune breeds envy as a carcass breeds flies. There were those at home who grudged him his glory, whispered against his honesty, and worked without ceasing to pull him down. but so long as the sovereign's favour held, and the friendship of the two women with it, the envious could not touch him, and he went from strength to strength under the shelter of a trust that nothing as yet could shake. The war that was to be the glory of the reign had begun in truth just before she came to the throne, and it grew out of one of the great dynastic crises of European history. The vast empire of Spain, with its possessions scattered across Europe and the wider world, had fallen vacant, its king dying without an heir, and the question of who should inherit it threatened to upset the whole balance of power among the nations. For the King of France, the mighty Louis XIV, the grandest and most formidable monarch in Europe, had manoeuvred to place his own grandson upon the empty Spanish throne, and to join the crowns of France and Spain in his family, and so to make himself the overlord of half the world. The other powers of the continent could not allow it, for it would have made France too strong for the liberty of any of them, and so they banded together, the English and the Dutch and the Austrians and many smaller states, to resist the overweening ambition of France and to break the union of the two great crowns. It was into this great struggle, the War of the Spanish Succession, that the new queen's reign was plunged from its very first days, and it was in that war that her general was to win her the undying glory of her name. And that the war into which her reign was plunged was, at bottom, a struggle to prevent one man from making himself the master of Europe, and that man was the most magnificent monarch of the age, the mighty King of France. For more than half a century he had reigned in unexampled splendour, the model of kingship for all the continent, the builder of a palace whose magnificence dazzled the world, the head of the strongest state and the finest army on the continent. And through all those years he had pressed steadily outward, swallowing territory, bullying his neighbours, extending the reach of France until the smaller powers about him trembled and the larger ones grew alarmed. He was the overshadowing fact of the age, this Sun King in his glory, and the great question of European politics was how to set bounds to his ambition before he overran them all. The train of events that lit the war is worth the following, for it was a tangle of wills and treaties and broken faith. The old King of Spain, the last of his line, lay long dying without a child, and the powers had schemed and bargained for years over the disposing of his immense inheritance, even drawing up solemn treaties to divide it peaceably among the rival claimants when he should die. But the dying king resolved that his dominions should not be carved up, left them whole by his last will to a grandson of the King of France, and that king, casting aside the treaties he had set his own hand to, accepted the whole inheritance for his house, and sent his grandson south to reign in Madrid. It was the overturning of the careful balance, the very thing the treaties of partition had been framed to prevent, and it brought the powers to the very brink. What tipped them over the edge was a further stroke of the French kings, for when the old exiled King of England died at last in his French refuge, the King of France proclaimed the dead man's son the rightful king of the English, in the teeth of the settlement they had made, and that insult, touching the nation's tenderest nerve, turned hesitation into resolve, and brought the island kingdom into the quarrel in deadly earnest. To grasp why the war mattered so much, and why the Queen and her ministers were willing to pour the blood and treasure of the nation into it for more than a decade, one must understand the shadow that lay over Europe in those years. The old King of France had made his country the greatest power the continent had seen since the days of Rome, and he seemed now on the point of swallowing the vast inheritance of Spain as well, with all its dominions in the Old World and the New, and of setting his own grandson upon the Spanish throne. Were that to come to pass, the two crowns might in time be joined, and a single over-mighty house would bestride the whole of the West, with no force left to stand against it, and the smaller nations, and the trade and the liberties of the seafaring peoples, would lie at its mercy. It was to prevent that engrossing of the world by a single hand that the long war was fought. Against that danger there was gathered a grand alliance of nations, knit together by treaty and common fear, of which the Queen's kingdom was the paymaster and one of the chief swords. The stout burghers of the Dutch Republic, who lay nearest the danger and had most to lose, were the closest of the allies. The Emperor, in his eastern capital, whose own house had a claim to the Spanish throne, was another, and a host of lesser princes of the German lands sent their regiments to swell the common army. It was a coalition of many peoples and many tongues and many jealousies, hard to hold together and harder still to drive in a single direction, and much of the general's genius lay not in the winning of battles alone, but in the patient art of keeping so many quarrelsome partners yoked to the common task. And the war was sustained at home by a thing as new and as remarkable as any victory in the field, a revolution in the handling of money that allowed a small island to wage war on a scale far beyond what its bare revenues could have borne. New ways of public borrowing had lately grown up, by which the nation pledged its future taxes to raise vast sums in the present, and a moneyed interest of merchants and financiers arose to lend the crown the means of war, so that the long struggle was fought not only with powder and steel, but with credit and paper, with loans and funds and the confidence of lenders in the good faith of the state. It was an unglamorous foundation for so much glory, this machinery of borrowing and lending, but it was the foundation nonetheless, and without it the armies could never have marched, nor the famous victories been won. The age that produced the brilliance of Blenheim produced also the sober apparatus of modern public finance, and the second was quite as momentous as the first. It was a war for the balance of power, then a war to keep any single state from growing strong enough to dominate all the rest, and England threw herself into it with a will, for the English had their own reasons to fear and resist the mighty Catholic king across the Channel. He had sheltered the exiled Stuart claimant, and threatened to thrust him back upon the English throne by force. He was the champion of the Catholic cause that the English so dreaded, and his growing might menace English trade and English security alike. So the Queen's reign opened in a vast war against the mightiest monarch in Europe, a war that would last almost the whole length of her reign, and would either break her kingdom or raise it to greatness. And it was her good fortune and her glory that she had at her command the one general in Europe capable of bringing such a war to a triumphant end. The supreme moment of the war, and the victory that rang through Europe and made the Queen's reign forever famous, came in the high summer of 1704, on a field in southern Germany beside the river Danube, near a village whose name would become a glory of British arms. The French and their allies had marched deep into Germany, and threatened to knock the Austrians out of the war and bring the whole alliance crashing down, and Marlborough, in answer, made one of the boldest moves in the history of war, marching his army hundreds of miles across the continent with a speed and a secrecy that left his enemies bewildered, to fall upon the French where they least expected him. The two great armies met near the village of Blenheim, and there, in a long and bloody day of fighting, the genius of Marlborough won a victory so complete and so crushing that it astonished the world. The French army, which had not known a great defeat in living memory, was shattered, half of it killed or drowned in the river or taken prisoner, and the spell of French invincibility was broken at a stroke. The campaign that led to the crowning victory was a masterpiece of daring and deception, and it is worth following, for it shows the Duke's genius at its height. The danger that year was acute, for the French and their allies were poised to strike at the heart of the alliance, to march upon the Austrian capital and knock Austria out of the war, which might have brought the whole coalition down in ruin. The Duke saw that the threatened ally must be saved, and that to save it he must march his army from the Low Countries, where it lay all the way across Germany to the Danube, hundreds of miles through the heart of the continent, a march so long and so bold that no one, friend or enemy, believed he would attempt it. He kept his true purpose secret even from his allies, gave out that he was bound for somewhere else, and set off. And by the time his enemies understood where he was going, it was too late to stop him. He brought his army to the Danube in fine condition, having planned every halt and every supply with a care that left the men fresh at the end of the long march, and there he joined the imperial forces and sought out the French and their allies for battle. The two great armies met near a village called Blenheim on an August day, and the fighting was long and desperate and bloody, swaying back and forth through the heat of the day while the issue hung in doubt. But the Duke's grip never loosened. He saw the decisive point, massed his strength against it, and broke the enemy centre with a furious charge that split their army in two, and what had been a battle became a rout. The French army was destroyed, a large part of it killed, drowned in the river behind them, or taken prisoner, including the commander himself, and the spell of French invincibility, unbroken for a generation, was shattered in a single day. The victory was the more astonishing for the audacity of the stroke that produced it, for the general had done a thing that no commander of that cautious age was expected to do, leaving the Allies to guard the Low Countries. He had marched his army the whole length of Germany, hundreds of miles up the valley of the broad river, by a feat of secrecy and speed, and careful provisioning that left even his own officers guessing at his purpose until he was almost upon the enemy. There, deep in the south, he joined his force to that of the brilliant prince who commanded the emperor's troops, a soldier as bold and as gifted as himself, and the two of them, in perfect accord, fell upon the French and their allies beside a small village whose name was about to ring through Europe. It was a battle of vast armies and terrible slaughter, and at the end of the day, the seemingly invincible host of the French king was destroyed, its commander himself taken prisoner and carried back in time to England as the living proof of the triumph. The news of it came home to a kingdom that had grown used to a war of sieges and skirmishes and small advantage, and that had hardly dared to hope for a victory so complete. The story was long told of how the general, weary on the field, with the dead still lying thick around him, scribbled a few hurried lines upon a scrap of paper, a tavern reckoning by the tale, and sent them spurring across Europe to his wife, begging her to carry to the Queen the word that her army had won a glorious victory. Whatever the truth of the scrap of paper, the word came, and with it a wave of rejoicing, such as had not been known for generations, the bells pealing from every steeple, the bonfires blazing in every town, the whole nation lifted up at once into an unaccustomed pride. And the Queen gave thanks for it in the way that came most naturally to her devout and grateful heart, going in solemn state through the rejoicing streets of her capital to the chief cathedral, there to render praise to the God of battles for the deliverance of her people. It became the pattern of those years, this marriage of arms and worship, the victory in the field followed by the thanksgiving at the altar, the Queen at the head of her people, returning thanks for each fresh mercy of the war, and there was something in it deeply suited to her nature. The quiet, pious woman made the centre of her nation's gratitude, giving back to heaven the glory that her armies won on earth. For a few bright years the triumphs came almost faster than the thanksgivings could keep pace with them, and the reign that had opened so doubtfully stood crowned with a martial glory beyond anything its subjects had dreamed. The magnitude of the victory is hard to overstate, for it changed the whole course of the war and the whole standing of the powers. France, which had not suffered such a defeat in living memory, reeled under the blow. The threatened ally was saved. The alliance, which had been wavering, was heartened and held together, and the reputation of British arms, which had counted for little in the great wars of the continent, was made at a stroke, The little island kingdom, ruled by an ailing woman carried to her own coronation in a chair, had produced the general who had humbled the greatest power in Europe on the field of battle, and Europe took note. From that day the war turned in the Allies' favour, and the name of the village by the Danube became, and remains, a word for glory in the annals of the nation, the first and the greatest of the victories that crowned the Queen's reign. The news of Blenheim was carried home to England, and fell upon the nation like a thunderclap of joy, for it was the greatest victory English arms had won upon the continent for centuries, and it transformed the standing of the country in the eyes of the world. The Queen received the news with a quiet and heartfelt thankfulness, and went in solemn state to give thanks for it, and a grateful nation and a grateful sovereign cast about for some fitting reward for the general who had wrought the miracle. The reward they settled on was princely beyond anything given to a subject in that age, for the Queen granted to Marlborough a great royal manor, and the means to build upon it a palace worthy of his triumph, a vast and splendid house that was to be called, in memory of the battle, Blenheim, and that stands to this day one of the noblest houses in England, the monument in stone to the victory that crowned the Queen's reign. The friendship of the two women had borne in this great house a fruit more lasting than either of them could have foreseen. The raising of it fell to the boldest and most theatrical builder of the age, a man of soaring imagination who conceived not a comfortable dwelling but a monument of state, a pile of dramatic masses and mighty colonnades, meant to overwhelm the beholder with the glory of the day it commemorated. He had been, before he turned to building, a writer of comedies for the playhouse, and he brought to his architecture something of the theatre, a love of bold effect and sweeping approach and noble skyline that made his buildings seem less like dwellings than like scenes set upon a stage. The Duchess, who took the oversight of the work upon herself, was at war with him almost from the first, for she wanted a home that could be lived in where he wanted a marvel that could be wondered at, and the two of them clashed over every line of the design, the placing of every window, the height of every wall. It was an ill-matched pairing, the practical, domineering woman and the visionary, extravagant builder, and their long quarrel over the work became one of the celebrated feuds of the day, a war of two stubborn temperaments fought out in stone across the years. It took to raise the enormous pile. It was, in truth, almost too grand, a pile built more to glorify a victory than to be lived in, and the building of it brought its own troubles, for the costs ran far beyond the first reckoning, and the quarrels over the money soured in time into one more thread in the unravelling of the great friendship. The Duchess, who came to oversee the work, fought bitterly with the architect over his soaring, extravagant designs, wanting a comfortable house where he wanted a sublime monument, and when the royal favour failed and the public money dried up, the half-finished palace stood for years as a reproach and a burden. But it was finished at last, and it stands today among the noblest seats in the land, a vast and splendid pile rising from its lake and its park, the single greatest material legacy of the whole reign. There is a kind of irony in the durability of it, for of all the things the Queen and her general and her friend made together, that this palace has outlasted them all and speaks for them still. The battles are names in the history books now, the war a distant quarrel over a long-dead king's inheritance, the friendship of the two women a sad story of love turned to hatred. But the vast palace stands, generation after generation, drawing the wondering visitor through its staterooms and its galleries, a monument in stone to a victory and a partnership and an age. The friendship behind it would end in bitterness, and the Duke and Duchess would be driven from court in disgrace before it was even finished. But the house outlived the quarrels, as such places do, and keeps in its proud and theatrical splendour the memory of the brief, brilliant years when the Queen, the soldier, and the favourite stood together at the summit of the world. Blenheim was the most dazzling of the victories, but it was not the only one, for the war ground on for years more, and Marlborough's genius continued to carry all before it. 2 years after Blenheim, he won another sweeping battle in the Low Countries, as crushing as the first, that drove the French out of much of the Spanish Netherlands. 2 years after that, another, and 2 years later, another still, the bloodiest of them all, a victory so dearly bought in the lives of his soldiers that it shook the nation even in its triumph. Town after town fell to him, fortress after fortress. The armies of Britain, which a generation before had counted for little in the wars of Europe, were now the terror of the French and the admiration of their allies. And the war was not only fought in Europe, for far away in the Mediterranean a British fleet seized the towering rock that guards the gateway to that sea, the fortress of Gibraltar, and held it against every effort to retake it, and it has remained in British hands from that day to this. Under the ailing queen who could not walk to her own coronation, her small kingdom was rising, year by year, to the rank of a great power. The glory of those years was not won upon the land alone, for while the general marched and fought in the heart of Europe, the Queen's ships were busy upon every sea, and it was at sea, in the long run, that the most lasting of the gains were made. In the same summer that brought the famous victory on the river, a squadron of the Queen's navy seized a mighty rock that guarded the narrow gate between two seas, a fortress so placed that whoever held it commanded the passage of all the trade and all the fleets that went that way. And once taken it was never given back but held thenceforward as a possession of the crown, a key to the inner sea kept in the Queen's own hand. A neighbouring island fell soon after, with its fine harbour, and these together gave the nation a naval reach into waters it had never before controlled. Across the wider ocean, too, the war carried her flag and her arms into the New World, where her forces took from the French a province of the northern wilderness, a cold and forested country of broad rivers and long winters, whose chief stronghold was renamed in her own honour, and bears a form of her name to this day. Other posts and territories changed hands in those years, by force and by treaty, until the small island kingdom found itself mistress of new dominions scattered across half the globe, the seeds of an empire whose vast growth lay still far in the future, but whose first foundations were being laid, almost unnoticed, amid the louder triumphs of the European war. It was by the slow accumulation of such gains, the rock and the island and the wilderness province and the rest, far more than by any single dazzling stroke, that the nation climbed in those years to the front rank of the powers of the world. When the Queen came to the throne, her kingdom had been a second-rate state, lately raised to consequence by one hard struggle. By the time her reign drew towards its close, it stood among the foremost nations of the earth, its navy supreme upon the seas, its trade spreading into every ocean, its word weighing heavy in the councils of Europe. The woman who presided over that ascent had little enough to do with the planning of it, and would have been hard put to find the new conquests upon a map, but it was in her name and in her reign that they were won, and the great power that her island became was, for all time after, the power that had risen under Queen Anne. There was more to the winning of the war than the Duke's famous pitched days, for between the great battles lay the long, grinding, unglamorous labour of the sieges, and it was in these as much as in the open field that the war was truly decided. Fortress by fortress, the strong places that guarded the road into the enemy's country had to be invested and battered and starved into surrender, a slow business of trenches and mines and bombardment that wore down the besiegers almost as cruelly as the besieged, and that filled the weary months between the summer's marching. Through all of it the Duke worked in close and perfect concert with the imperial commander who was his friend and his equal in skill, the two of them sharing their plans and their dangers and their fame as few allied generals ever have. But the struggle was changing its character as the years wore on, growing slower and costlier and less decisive, the enemy learning at last to shun the open battles in which the Duke could not be beaten, and at home the long expense of it, the rising taxes and the lengthening rolls of the slain, was breeding a weariness of the whole business that no fresh laurel could quite dispel. The triumphs were not confined to the pitched battles in the Low Countries, for the war was fought across the world, and other prizes fell to British arms in distant places. In the Mediterranean, a British fleet seized the towering rock that commands the narrow gateway between that sea and the ocean, the fortress of Gibraltar, and held it against every assault, so that it became, and has remained ever since, an outpost of British power guarding one of the chief crossroads of the world. Other conquests followed, in the islands of the Mediterranean and across the Atlantic in the New World, where a French stronghold was taken and renamed in the Queen's own honour. Year by year, victory by victory, the small kingdom that had seemed of so little account was rising to the front rank of the powers of the earth, laying the foundations of a greatness that would, in the generations to come, carry its flag and its language around the globe. But glory has its price, and the price of these victories was paid in the blood of the soldiers, and as the war dragged on the price came to seem too high. The last of the major battles, fought towards the end of the long struggle, was a victory, but a victory so bloody, so dearly bought in the lives of the men who won it, that the nation recoiled from the news of it even as it celebrated. The slaughter was appalling, the cost out of all proportion to the gain, and a deep weariness of the war began to spread through the country, a sense that enough blood had been shed and enough treasure spent in a quarrel that dragged on without end. The glory was real, and the rise of the nation was real, but so were the lengthening casualty lists and the mounting taxes and the growing longing for peace, and in that growing weariness lay the seeds of the political upheaval that would, in the reign's later years, cast down the men who had won the glory and bring the long war at last to its close. Yet the achievement of her reign that was to prove the most lasting of all was not won upon any battlefield, but in the council chamber and the Parliament House, and it changed the very shape of the nation forever. For all through her reign there had been a vast unfinished question close to home, the question of Scotland, which though it shared a king with England was still a wholly separate kingdom, with its own parliament and its own laws, and its own quarrelsome and independent spirit, and the union of the two crowns in one person had never grown into a true union of the two realms. It was an arrangement full of friction and danger, and the danger sharpened when the Scots, angered at being given no say in the English settlement of the succession, threatened to choose a different king of their own when the Queen should die, and so to break the crowns apart again, and open the door to the exiled Stuarts and to France. To the wiser heads on both sides, it became clear that the two kingdoms must either draw together into one, or fall apart into enmity, and the Queen, who longed above all things for the safety and the unity of her island, set her heart upon bringing them together. The making of the union was a far harder and a far more delicate business than the winning of any battle, for it required the persuading of two proud and suspicious nations to give up something of themselves for a common good that many on both sides could not see. England and Scotland had shared a king for 100 years, ever since the Scottish line had inherited the English throne, but they had remained in every other respect two separate countries, with their own parliaments, their own laws, their own churches, their own fierce national pride, and the sharing of a single monarch had bred quite as much friction as friendship between them. The Scots resented their poorer and weaker position, the way the joint crown was run for English interests. The English looked down on their northern neighbours and feared them as a back door through which France and the exiled Stuarts might strike. The grievances that drove the two kingdoms towards the crisis were real and deep, and on the northern side they were sharpened by a recent and a bitter disaster. The Scots had staked much of their scanty wealth upon a bold scheme to plant a colony of their own upon a far isthmus of the New World, and the venture had failed utterly in fever and ruin, and the hostility of stronger powers carrying down with it the savings of half the nation, and leaving a smouldering resentment against the richer southern kingdom that many blamed for the catastrophe. Smarting under this and other wrongs, the Parliament at Edinburgh had begun to flex its independence, passing a law that reserved to itself the right to choose a different successor to its own crown when the Queen should die, a direct threat to wrench the two kingdoms apart, and the Parliament at Westminster had answered with a sharp measure of its own, threatening the Scots with the loss of their trading privileges unless they should come to terms. It was a dangerous game of threat and counter-threat, with the two peoples drifting towards open rupture, and it was out of this hard bargaining, this mixture of grievance and pressure and mutual need, that the movement for a true and lasting joining at last gathered its decisive force. The negotiations were long and bitter, and beset with difficulty, for there was deep resistance on both sides, and in Scotland especially, the proposed union roused a storm of national feeling. To many Scots it seemed a betrayal, the selling of their ancient independent kingdom, the extinction of their old parliament that had sat for centuries, the swallowing of their nation by their larger and richer neighbour. And the measure was carried through the Scottish Parliament against fierce opposition, amid riots in the streets and accusations of bribery and worse. It was an unlovely process, the making of the Union, full of hard bargaining and harder feelings, and it left a residue of resentment in Scotland that would not soon fade. But it was carried against all the difficulty, and the Queen had her dearest wish. And what was born of all that bitter wrangling was a new nation that would, whatever its troubled beginnings, grow into one of the great powers of the modern world. After long and difficult and often bitter negotiation, the thing was done, and in 1707 the two ancient kingdoms of England and Scotland were joined together by treaty into a single united realm, a new nation that took the name of Great Britain, with one parliament and one flag and one common destiny. It was a momentous step, resisted bitterly by many on both sides, in Scotland especially, where the loss of the old independent parliament was mourned as a national humbling, but it was carried through, and it held, and it has shaped the history of the world from that day to this. And at the centre of it stood the Queen, who had wanted it more than anyone, and worked for it more steadily than anyone, and who became, on the day the union took effect, no longer merely Queen of England and of Scots, but the first sovereign of the new and greater nation of Great Britain. Of all the achievements of her reign, this was the one that would outlast all the rest, for the battles were won and forgotten, but the realm she had helped to make endured and endures, and she had given it, with her own hand, her name. It is worth pausing to weigh what was accomplished in that union, for of all the achievements of the reign, it is the one whose consequences have reached furthest down the centuries, two ancient kingdoms, each with its long and separate history, each with its own fierce sense of itself, were merged into a single state, with one parliament to govern them, one set of trade laws to bind their economies together, one flag to fly over them both. It was not a conquest, for Scotland kept her own church and her own law and her own distinct identity within the larger whole. It was a true marriage of nations, freely if reluctantly entered into, and for all the bitterness of its making, it proved extraordinarily durable, holding together through 3 centuries of storms that might have torn a lesser bond apart. And out of that union there grew, in the generations that followed, something far larger than its makers can have imagined, for the new-made Great Britain became, within a century, the workshop and the counting house and the naval power of the world, the heart of an empire that spread its language and its laws and its trade across the whole of the earth. None of that was visible in the Queen's day, when the new-made nation was still a small and a quarrelsome place on the edge of Europe, lately risen to importance through one great war, but the foundation was laid in her reign, the two kingdoms joined into one, and upon that foundation the whole future greatness was built. The queen who joined them could not see the harvest, but she planted the seed. The terms on which the two kingdoms came together were carefully drawn, and they shaped the new state in ways that have lasted to this day. Scotland was to send members to sit in the Parliament of the United Realm, a body of her own choosing to the lower house, and a chosen handful of her peers to the upper, so that her voice should be heard, if faintly, in the common councils of the whole. Her ancient law was left standing, and her own form of the reformed religion, the church of her people, was guaranteed against all interference, so that she gave up her separate parliament, but kept her separate soul. Trade was thrown open between the two countries, the coinage and the weights and the customs made one, and a sum of money was paid northward to balance the old accounts and to soften the sting of the new taxes, and over all there flew, for the first time, a single flag, in which the emblems of the two countries were knit together into one. It was a careful and a durable settlement, and for all the anger that attended its birth, it held and grew and made of the two old enemies one lasting people. The glory of the reign was not all a matter of battles and treaties, for those years were also one of the high ages of the English mind, a time of such brilliance in letters and learning and the arts that it was thereafter called after her, and men spoke of the age of Queen Anne as a kind of golden noon of English civilization. It was the age of the brilliant satirists and essayists and poets, of writers whose wit and grace and good sense set a standard for all who came after, who made the English language into a polished and a supple instrument, and filled the coffee-houses of London with the play of their ideas. It was the age, too, in which the long labour of rebuilding the city after the fire of a generation before came at last to its crown, as the mighty new cathedral of St. Paul's, the masterpiece of the greatest of English architects, was finished and stood complete upon its hill above the river, the noblest church the nation had ever raised. And in the quiet of the universities, the deepest mind of the age, the man who had unlocked the laws by which the very planets move, lived on into the reign as its presiding genius, so that the years of the ailing queen were lit, in every field of human endeavour, by a constellation of greatness. The flowering of letters that gave the age its lasting fame was centred on the new and bustling world of the London coffee-houses, where the wits and writers of the day gathered to talk and argue and read aloud their latest productions. It was a sociable, conversational, urbane kind of literature that flourished there, a literature of essays and satires and polished verse, aimed at the cultivated general reader and prizing above all things clarity, wit, good sense, and elegance of form. The finest writers of the age perfected a way of writing English prose that was lucid and graceful and easy, a model that would be imitated for generations, and they turned their pens to everything, to politics and morals and manners and the small comedy of daily life, holding up to their readers a glass in which a whole society could see itself reflected. The towering figures of this literary age were a handful of men of genius, whose names have never since fallen out of honour, a satirist of savage and unequalled power, a poet whose polished couplets became the very definition of elegance, an essayist who taught a whole nation to laugh gently at itself, a writer of tales who all but invented a new kind of book. They knew one another, quarrelled and allied with one another, wrote for and against one another, and together they made the reign a high noon of English wit and English prose. Some of them were deep in the politics of the day, writing for this party or that, lending their genius to the fierce quarrels of the hour, and the closeness of letters and politics in that age, the way the finest writers served the rival parties with their pens, gives the literature of the reign much of its peculiar energy and bite. It is one of the happy accidents of history that so much brilliance should have gathered in a single reign, and it had little enough to do with the Queen herself, who was no eager reader and no patron of wit, and whose own dull and pious court was the despair of the brilliant men who frequented the coffee-houses rather than the palace. The genius of the age flowered in spite of the court, not because of it, in the clubs and the coffee-houses and the printing shops of a great and growing city, but it flowered in her reign, and it took her name, and the justice of that is not really an injustice, for an age is more than its sovereign, and the brilliance that gathered under her unregarding eye was a true part of the greatness of her time. The sad, half-blind queen presided, without quite knowing it, over one of the most luminous moments in the whole history of her nation's mind. There was a grace and an order, too, in the very look and feel of the age, in its buildings and its furniture and its silver and its dress, a quiet classical elegance that has kept its charm across 3 centuries, so that we speak still of the houses and the chairs and the silver of the Queen Anne style, and mean by it a thing of restrained and comfortable and well-proportioned beauty. She herself was no great patron of the arts, no brilliant centre of a brilliant court. She was too ill, too shy, too sunk in her private griefs for that, and her court was a quiet and a dull one, mourned by those who remembered the gaieties of earlier reigns. But the age flowered around her all the same, in the city and the country and the world of letters, and it took her name and keeps it. And there is a justice in that the quiet, sorrowful woman on the throne should have lent her name to so much brightness, as though the nation, grateful for the greatness of her years, had wished to bind her memory forever to its golden age. The same restrained classical good taste that marked the letters of the age marked its buildings and its furnishings and its whole material face. And it is in this, perhaps, that the Queen's name lives most familiarly today. For we speak still 3 centuries on of the style of her reign as a thing instantly recognizable and much loved, a manner of building and making that prized proportion, restraint, comfort, and a sober elegance over mere magnificence. The houses of the age were modest and well-mannered, and beautifully proportioned, of warm red brick with white-painted windows set in pleasing rhythm. The furniture was graceful and comfortable, with the gentle curves and the quiet refinement that collectors prize to this day. The silver was plain and shapely and fine. It was the taste of a prosperous, sensible, civilized society, neither grand nor mean, and it has worn so well that it is still a byword for a certain understated good taste. The greatest monument of the age in stone was the vast new cathedral that crowned the city of London, rising at last to completion in the Queen's reign after decades of labour. The old cathedral had been destroyed in the great fire that had devoured the city a generation before, and in its place the supreme architect of the age had raised a wholly new church, a mighty domed masterpiece that was the largest and the noblest building the nation had ever produced, and the great dome was finished and the whole vast work completed in the years of the Queen. It stood and stands as the visible symbol of the age, a thing of order and grandeur and serene proportion rising above the smoke of the growing city, the masterpiece of English building and one of the great churches of the world. And over all the intellectual life of the age there presided, in the quiet of the universities, the supreme mind of the era, and one of the supreme minds of all human history, the man who had discovered the laws that govern the motion of the heavens and the fall of an apple alike, and who lived on into the Queen's reign as the venerable sovereign of the world of learning. The Queen indeed honoured him, conferring on him a knighthood, so that the greatest of natural philosophers received from her hand a public mark of the nation's esteem. Between them, the writers and the architects and the philosophers of the reign made it an age of such various and such enduring brilliance that the nation ever after was glad to bind the Queen's gentle name to it, and to call that whole luminous season, in arms and letters and learning alike, the age of Queen Anne. But while the reign blazed in glory abroad and at home, the long friendship that lay at its heart was quietly falling to pieces, and the breaking of it is one of the saddest of the many sad threads of the Queen's life. For the brilliant Sarah, the adored friend of 40 years, had grown, with the passing of time and the growth of her power, into something the Queen could no longer bear. She was domineering and tactless and forever in the right, this proud Duchess, and she presumed upon the old intimacy to lecture and to scold, and to bully her royal mistress, to press her politics upon her, and to treat her, more and more, not as a sovereign and a friend, but as a backward pupil to be managed and corrected. She was, besides, a fierce partisan of one of the two great parties that divided the nation, and she laboured without ceasing to bend her royal mistress to that party's service, until the Queen, who leaned by temper and conviction the other way, came to dread her visits and her letters and the endless hectoring that came with them. The adoration of the lonely princess had cooled, across the years, into weariness and resentment, and the bond that had ruled her life was wearing through. The faults that destroyed the great friendship were all on the side of the brilliant Duchess, and they were the faults of a strong nature grown overbearing through long indulgence. She had been used, for 40 years, to being adored, to having her own way with the shy friend who worshipped her, and she had come to take that adoration as her due, and to presume upon it without limit. She lectured her mistress, scolded her, contradicted her flatly, treated her opinions with open contempt, and bombarded her with letters and harangues of advice and reproach, never doubting for a moment her own right to direct and correct her sovereign as she had once directed and corrected her girlhood friend. She had no tact, no patience, no capacity to bend, and she mistook the Queen's long-suffering meekness for weakness, never seeing the deep, obstinate strength beneath it, nor understanding that even the gentlest patience can at last be worn through. Above all, she made the fatal error of forcing politics upon a friendship that had been for the Queen a refuge from all such cares. The Duchess was a fierce and uncompromising partisan of one of the two great parties of the state, and she could not let the matter rest, but laboured without ceasing to drag the Queen over to her own side, to fill the government with her party's men, to make the royal favour serve the party cause. She would not see that the Queen's own convictions leaned strongly the other way, towards the party of the Church and the Crown that the Duchess despised. She battered at the Queen's settled opinions as though they were mere obstinacy to be overcome, and turned every conversation into a political wrangle, until the Queen came to dread her company as a torment to be endured, rather than a comfort to be sought. So the long adoration cooled, by degrees, into weariness, and the weariness hardened into a settled aversion, though Anne, in her shy way, long shrank from any open break, and let the wretched friendship drag on past the point where any warmth was left in it. The Duchess, blind to the change until it was far advanced, went on hectoring and presuming as before, never grasping that the ground had shifted beneath her, that the mistress who had once been unable to bear an hour's coldness from her now longed for nothing so much as to be free of her. The bond that had ruled the Queen's whole life, the great romance of her lonely youth, was wearing through at last under the relentless friction of the Duchess's domineering temper, and into the widening gap there was about to step, soft-footed and self-effacing, the gentle cousin who would supplant her. Into the gap there stepped, quietly and with the softest of footfalls, another woman, a poor relation of the great Duchess herself, whom Sarah had charitably brought to court and placed in her household, never dreaming what she was doing. This new attendant, Abigail by name, was everything that Sarah was not gentle and humble and soothing and undemanding, and she had the art, which the domineering Duchess had wholly lost, of making the tired and ailing Queen feel comfortable and cared for. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, her wounded affections turned from the friend who tormented her to the new companion who soothed her, and Abigail rose in the royal favour as Sarah declined, until the humble cousin had supplanted her brilliant patroness in her own heart. And because the gentle Abigail leaned, in politics, the very way that heart inclined, and because she was guided by clever men of that party, her rise was a political fact as well as a personal one, and the change in her affections helped to shift the whole balance of power in the state. The newcomer's history was a humble one, and it lent a peculiar sharpness to her triumph over her brilliant cousin. She was the daughter of a city merchant who had failed in his business and left his children to make their own way in the world, and she had been taken in her need, by the very Duchess she was now supplanting, and given a modest place about the court through that lady's careless charity. From so low a beginning she rose by the soft arts of the bedchamber, by attentiveness and discretion, and the gift of being always quietly useful, until she had wound herself into the Queen's confidence past the power of her patroness to dislodge her. There was even a marriage made quietly and with the Queen's own knowledge, but kept hidden from the Duchess, to a gentleman of the household, and when Sarah learned of it at last, and understood how far the Queen's intimacy with her despised dependent had gone behind her back, the discovery struck her like a blow, for it told her that she had been supplanted not only in affection, but in trust, and that the poor relation she had raised from nothing had built in secret a place in the royal heart that she herself could no longer reach. Slowly, and at first quite invisibly, her wounded affections shifted from the friend who tormented her to the servant who soothed her. There was little dramatic in it, no single moment of transfer. It was the gradual, natural turning of a starved heart towards the warmth that was offered it, away from the warmth that had been withdrawn. The Queen came to depend on the gentle Abigail, to confide in her, to find in her quiet company the comfort that the Duchess no longer gave. And the humble bedchamber attendant, who had entered the household as a nobody, became by degrees the closest companion of her later years, the keeper of her confidence, and the soother of her cares. And because little at that court was ever merely personal, the rise of the new favourite was a political event of the first importance. For the soft-spoken Abigail was guided by clever and ambitious men, kinsmen and allies who saw in her growing influence over the Queen a lever to move the whole machine of the state, and who used her quiet access to the royal ear to undermine the Duchess's party and advance their own. The change in the Queen's affections thus became a change in the balance of power, helping to topple the party of the war and the Marlboroughs, and to raise up the party of peace and the church, and the soft-footed bedchamber woman, almost without seeming to act at all, helped to shift the government of a great nation. It is one of the strangest features of that strange age, the immense political weight that could rest upon the private affections of a lonely woman, and the great consequences that could flow from the simple human fact that a tired Queen preferred the company that soothed her to the company that scolded her. When the Duchess understood at last what was happening, that she was being supplanted in the heart of the mistress she had ruled for 40 years, and supplanted by a creature of her own bringing, her fury knew no bounds, and she turned upon the Queen with reproaches and recriminations that only drove her the faster away. There was a terrible scene between them, the last but one of their meetings, on a day of public thanksgiving for one of the great victories. When the Queen had not worn the jewels the Duchess thought she ought, and the Duchess, in the very coach and at the very door of the cathedral, so far forgot herself as to hush her sovereign angrily, to bid her be quiet, before the eyes of the watching court. It was an unforgivable thing, and it was not forgiven. The friendship of a lifetime was past mending now, and after one last cold and fruitless interview, in which the Queen would say nothing but the same few stony words over and over, and Sarah pleaded in vain for the warmth that was gone forever. The two women who had loved each other for 40 years parted, and never met again. The final scenes of the long friendship were painful in the extreme, a slow and bitter unravelling that did credit to neither woman but fell hardest, in the end, upon the one who had presumed too much. As Sarah felt the Queen's favour slipping from her towards her own poor cousin, she did not retreat with dignity, but fought furiously and clumsily to recover her lost ground, and every blow she struck drove the Queen further away. She reproached, she threatened, she demanded, she even stooped to dark hints about the nature of the Queen's affection for the new favourite, spreading whispers that did her own cause no good, and her sovereign a cruel wrong. And the more she raged, the colder and the more immovable her mistress became, retreating behind that wall of stony patience against which the Duchess's fury beat itself out in vain. The severing when it came was as complete in its outward forms as in its inward feeling, and the trappings of 40 years of favour were stripped away one by one. The offices the Duchess had held, the keeping of the privy purse, and the mistressship of the robes and the rest, were taken from her and given to others, and she was required to surrender the gold key that was the badge of her place about the sovereign. She flung it from her by one account, in a final passion, rather than yield it up meekly. The fine lodgings she had occupied in the royal palaces were emptied of her belongings, and she stripped them as she went even of their brass locks and marble chimney-pieces in a last spiteful wrangle over what was hers to carry away. Her husband, though he lingered a while longer at the head of the army, was soon to follow her into disgrace, and the pair of them, who had ruled the court and the camp between them, withdrew at last from the centre of affairs to their own half-built palace in the country, there to nurse their grievances, and reckon the bitter cost of having presumed too far upon a sovereign's worn-out patience. The Duchess had, however, the last word, as she had always meant to, for she lived on for 30 years after the Queen's death, a rich, formidable, embittered old woman, and she spent much of that long widowhood justifying herself and blackening the memory of the mistress she had lost. She wrote her own account of their friendship and its ending, an account shaped throughout to her own advantage, painting the Queen as dull, weak, ungrateful, and stupid, and herself as the wronged and faithful friend. And because she wrote so vividly, and the Queen left no answer, the Duchess's version long coloured the way history remembered them both. It was an unworthy revenge, this blackening of a dead friend's name, and later ages have learned to read it with caution and to do more justice to the patient, suffering Queen than her brilliant enemy allowed. But it is a sad coda to a sad story that the great friendship of the Queen's life should have ended not only in coldness but in calumny, and that the woman she had loved most in the world should have spent her last decades teaching the world to despise her. In the midst of these troubles there fell upon the Queen another and a heavier blow, the loss of the husband who had been, through all the long years of sorrow, her one steady comfort. Prince George, the placid, faithful companion of her life, had never been strong, and his health failed badly in the autumn of 1708, and after a slow and laboured decline he died, leaving the Queen a widow, and more alone than she had ever been. Whatever the witty world had thought of the dull good prince, he had been the rock of his wife's existence, the one person who had been always there, asking nothing, giving everything, through every grief and every disappointment of her hard life, and his loss struck her to the heart. She shut herself away in her sorrow, clinging to the body and refusing to be parted from it, sunk in a grief so deep that those about her grew alarmed, and the great Duchess, called to attend her in her mourning as her office required, chose that moment of all moments to behave with a coldness, and a want of feeling that wounded the Queen afresh and drove the last nail into the coffin of their friendship. The Queen had lost, within a few years, her last child, her husband, and the friend of her whole life, and she faced what remained of her reign and her days alone. The marriage that ended with his death had been in its quiet and unregarded way the surest comfort of her existence, and to understand her desolation one must understand what she had lost in him. He had been no brilliant man, and the wits of the court had made free with his dullness and his heaviness and his fondness for the bottle. But he had loved her steadily for 25 years, had stood beside her through the whole long martyrdom of her childbearing and her child losing, had asked nothing of her but to share her life, and had given her in return a devotion without a flaw. She had made him her Lord High Admiral, set him at the head of her navy in the Great War, and leaned upon his placid strength through all the storms of her reign. And now the heavy, kindly, faithful presence that had filled the rooms beside her own for half a lifetime was simply gone, and the rooms were empty, and she was alone in a way she had never been before. Her grief was overwhelming and would not be comforted, and those about her feared for a time that it might carry her after him. So deep was the prostration into which it flung her. She shut herself away with the body, could not be parted from it, clung to the dead hand as though her own holding might keep some warmth in it, and the business of the kingdom stood still, while the Queen wept in the darkened rooms for the only human creature who had loved her without wanting anything from her in return. It was the heaviest of all the many blows her life had dealt her, heavier even than the loss of her children, for they had been taken from her before she had truly known them, while he had been the daily companion of her whole-grown life, and his going left her without any near and loving presence in the world at all. And it was at this, of all moments, that the friend of her youth chose to show herself most coldly, in a manner the Queen never forgot, and perhaps never forgave. For when the great Duchess came to the side of the grieving widow, she came not with tenderness, but with a brisk and managing efficiency that jarred horribly upon the Queen's raw sorrow, hurrying her from the chamber of death, ordering away the things that spoke of the dead man, behaving throughout less like a loving friend than like a steward impatient to have a tiresome business done. Whether from a real hardness of heart or only from her own awkward incapacity for tenderness, the Duchess wounded the Queen in that hour past all healing, and the breach that had been widening between them for years was driven, by her coldness at the deathbed, almost to its final rupture. The Queen turned for what comfort she could find to the gentler companion who knew how to be quietly kind, and the long friendship took, in the chamber of the dead prince, a wound from which it never afterward recovered. The long war, meanwhile, that had brought the reign its glory was turning, in its later years, into a burden the nation no longer wished to bear. It had gone on for years beyond counting. It had cost rivers of money and oceans of blood, and the last of the great victories had been won at so dreadful a price in the lives of the soldiers that the nation recoiled from it, and a great weariness of the war settled over the country. The party that had driven the war, the party of the Duke of Marlborough and the fallen Duchess, lost its hold upon the Queen and upon the people, and the other party came to power, pledged to make an end of the fighting and to bring the weary nation peace. And so, after long and secret and not wholly honourable negotiation, the war was wound up, and a peace was made, and the great struggle that had filled the Queen's reign was brought to a close, with much gained for Britain and much, in the eyes of her abandoned allies, dishonourably given away. Now, the making of that peace was the work of the new ministry that had risen as the old friends fell, a set of men who had come to power partly upon the nation's weariness of the endless war, and who were resolved, by fair means or foul, to bring it to an end. The fighting had dragged on for year upon year, the victories growing costlier and the gains more doubtful, the bloodiest of all the battles having been less a triumph than a butchery that sickened the nation of the whole business. And there was a real and honourable case for ending it, for the original purpose of the war had largely been won, and the further prosecution of it seemed to promise only more slaughter for little profit. But the manner of the peace was another matter, and there clung to it a flavour of bad faith that has stained the memory of it ever since. For the ministers, in their eagerness to be quit of the war, opened secret dealings with the enemy behind the backs of the Allies, who had fought beside the nation for 10 long years, and they bound their own commander in the field with orders that forbade him to fight, so that he stood idle and shamed while the Allies he was pledged to support were left to face the enemy alone. It was a shabby business, this deserting of old comrades in the field for the sake of a separate bargain, and the Allies cried out bitterly against the perfidy of it, with a resentment that long outlived the peace itself. The country had won much glory in the war. It forfeited a measure of its honour in the manner of the ending. Yet the peace, when it came, was no small thing, and whatever the shabbiness of its making, it gave the kingdom much of lasting worth. The overmighty power that had threatened to engulf the West was checked and humbled. The two great crowns that might have been joined were kept forever apart. The rock and the island and the lands across the ocean were confirmed to the crown in lasting possession, and the trade and the security of the seafaring nation were set upon foundations that endured for generations. The Queen, who longed above all things for the bloodshed to cease, set her own weight behind the peace, and saw it through against the bitter opposition of those who had made the war. And if her ministers earned a lasting reproach of the deserted Allies, the Queen earned, at least in the eyes of her own weary people, the gentler title of the bringer of peace. It was a fitting close to a reign that had given the nation glory enough, that it should end at last in quietness. The making of the peace was bound up with the fall of the man who had won the war, for the great Duke of Marlborough, the architect of all the glory, came down at last with his wife into the ruin of the royal favour. With his Duchess banished from the Queen's heart and his party fallen from power, the Duke's enemies moved in upon him, and he was stripped of his commands and his offices, and driven, under a cloud of trumped-up charges, into a bitter foreign exile, the greatest soldier of the age cast off by the sovereign he had served so brilliantly. It was an ungrateful end to a glorious partnership, and it does the Queen little credit, but she had come to hate the Duchess past all reason, and the Duke fell with his wife, and the friendship that had begun in the romance of a lonely princess's youth, and had carried the nation to the heights of glory, ended in coldness and exile and disgrace. So passed from the stage the brilliant pair who had ruled the early reign, and the Queen in her last years was left to other and lesser hands. The fall of the great general was a sorry spectacle, and it showed the world how swiftly the favour that had raised a man to the summit could be withdrawn, and how little gratitude there is in the politics of nations. He had won for his country the most dazzling run of victories in its history, had broken the power of its greatest enemy, and carried its arms in triumph across Europe, and his reward, in the end, was to be turned out of all his offices upon a charge of having lined his own pockets with the army's money, dismissed in disgrace, and driven into a self-imposed exile abroad. There was perhaps some colour to the charges, for the handling of army money in that age was a loose and shadowy business, and few commanders kept their hands wholly clean. But the men who pressed them did so less from any zeal for honesty than from a hard determination to be rid of a great rival and to clear the way for their own peace. For the ministry that had risen to power was set upon ending the war, and the general was the war made flesh, its author and its champion, and the living obstacle to any peace that fell short of total victory. While he held his command, the war party had a head and a hope. With him cast down and gone, The road to the negotiating table lay open, so he was sacrificed to the peace, his glory counting for nothing against the convenience of the hour, and the nation that had rung its bells for his victories let him go into exile with scarcely a murmur, so quickly had the mood turned and the war grown hateful. It was an ungracious thing, this casting off of the man who had served the crown so well, and later ages have judged it harshly, but it was of a piece with the whole sad turning of those years, in which the bright loyalties of the reign's morning soured one by one into the coldness of its evening. And in the Queen's own breast, the fall of the general was knotted up inextricably with the fall of his wife, for the two could not be parted, and the disgrace of the husband followed hard upon the dismissal of the friend. The Queen had loved the wife and trusted the husband, had made the fortunes of them both and raised their house from nothing to the first rank of the realm, and now within the space of a few short years she put them both away from her, the friend in bitterness and the general in disgrace, and the great partnership that had defined the glory of her reign was broken at the very moment of its triumph. There was a kind of tragedy in it, that the Queen should have dismissed, almost together, the two human beings who had served her greatness best, and that the brilliant chapter of her reign should close not in honour and gratitude, but in suspicion, embarrassment, and exile. The hands that took up the work they laid down were, as the event proved, smaller hands by far, and over all the closing years of the reign there hung the great unanswered question, the question of what was to come after, for the Queen was failing and childless, and the succession she had settled upon the distant Hanoverians was bitterly contested in many hearts. Across the water there waited her half-brother, the Catholic prince whose birth had touched off the revolution long ago, the man his followers called the rightful king, and his enemies called the pretender, and around him gathered the hopes of all those who longed for the old line to be restored. Many in the land, in secret or openly, preferred him to the unknown Germans who were to have the crown, and there were intrigues and plots and whispered hopes that the Queen herself, at the last, might name her brother as her heir and undo the Hanoverian settlement. She never did. Her devotion to the Protestant Church held firm against every tug of blood and pity, but the question gnawed at the peace of her final years, and she went down towards her grave, knowing that her death might be the signal for strife, and that the crown she had worn might yet be fought for over her coffin. The whole anxious question turned upon the person of a single exiled young man, the son of the Queen's own father by his second marriage, the half-brother whose disputed birth had helped to drive that father from his throne. He was grown now to manhood in his long exile across the water, the recognised head of the fallen line, and to a great body of folk in the three kingdoms, and above all in the Queen's northern realm, he was no pretender at all, but the true and rightful king, kept from his own by an act of usurpation. These were the men of the lost cause who drank in secret to the king over the water and waited and plotted for the day of his return. And so long as the Queen reigned childless, with the throne sure to pass at her death to a distant German house, their hopes ran high that the old line might yet be restored, and the wanderer brought home to his father's crown. There was even, in those last uncertain years, a way by which the thing might lawfully have been done had the exiled prince been willing to pay the one price that was asked of him. For it was the religion of his house and his own unbending devotion to it that barred him from the throne, and it was hinted to him more than once that if he would but conform to the established church of the realm, the path to the succession might be opened, and the crown of his ancestors restored to him without a blow. But he would not. Whatever else might be said of him, the exiled prince held to the faith of his fathers with a steadfastness that cost him a kingdom, and refused to purchase a crown at the price of his conscience. And by that refusal he sealed the doom of his cause and left the throne to the strangers from the German lands. for the law had settled the succession upon a distant and elderly princess of that country, a granddaughter of an earlier king of her line, and upon her descendants after her, provided only that they held the Protestant faith, and it was to this remote and foreign house, rather than to her own near kinsman, that the Queen's crown was bound by law to pass. The Queen herself, it must be said, looked upon her German heirs with no great warmth, and would suffer none of them to come and dwell in her kingdom during her own lifetime, so that to the very end there hung over the realm an uneasy uncertainty as to what might happen in the hour of her death, whether the lawful heirs would take the throne in peace, or whether the exiled prince and his friends would make a stroke to seize it. The succession was settled on paper. Whether it would be settled, in fact, when the Queen at last lay dying, no one could be wholly sure, and there were those who feared the crown might still be fought for over her unburied body. The body that had borne so much was failing now in earnest, and the last years of the Queen were a long twilight of pain and weariness. She had never been well since her youth, and the endless childbearing and the endless grief had broken her health past repair, and she was tormented now by a cruel and crippling affliction of the joints that swelled her limbs and racked her with pain and robbed her by degrees of the power to move. She grew stout and heavy and almost helpless, unable to walk, carried everywhere in a chair, hoisted by machinery from one floor to another of her palaces, a poor suffering invalid wrapped in her robes of state. It was a melancholy spectacle, the Queen of a great and victorious nation reduced to such helplessness, and yet she bore it, as she had borne everything, with a patient, uncomplaining fortitude, dragging her broken body to the council table and the chapel, doing her duty to the last, a brave and sorrowful woman keeping faith with her people, though her own life had given her so little joy. The body that housed so much sorrow had long been failing, and in her last years it failed utterly, until the Queen of a great and victorious nation was reduced to a state that would have moved the hardest heart to pity. The gout that had tormented her for years now scarcely ever left her, swelling and crippling her limbs, so that she could neither walk nor stand without agony, and often could not move at all. She grew heavy and unwieldy past the helping of her own strength, and had to be carried everywhere in a chair, lifted from room to room by her servants, even hoisted from one floor to another by a kind of pulley and machine contrived for the purpose. Her sight, never good, had dimmed almost to blindness. Her hands could barely hold a pen, and the woman who had been carried to her crowning in a chair, lame and ailing at 37, ended her reign, a broken hulk, immovable, half-sighted, racked with pain, an old woman before her time, though she had not yet reached her 50th year, and the loneliness of those last years was as complete as the ruin of the body. Every creature she had loved was gone from her or estranged. Her many children lay in their small graves, every one. The husband who had been her daily comfort was 3 years dead, the friend of her youth, whom she had loved above all the rest, was cast off in bitterness, and would never come near her again. Her sister had died unreconciled long ago, and even the gentle companion who had supplanted the friend had proved in the end a self-seeker who cooled towards her mistress as the Queen's power to reward her waned. There was no one left to love her for herself, no one to sit with her in the long evenings of pain for the simple sake of her company. There were only servants and ministers and place-seekers gathered about a dying source of favour, waiting upon a queen who had outlived every affection of her heart. So she sat out her last years in her quiet palace beyond the city, a swollen, suffering, lonely woman, at the centre of a brilliant and triumphant reign, surrounded by the trophies of a glory that had brought her no happiness, and the apparatus of a greatness that could not ease her pain. The nation she ruled stood at the summit of its fortunes, its armies victorious, its trade flourishing, its name great among the powers of the earth, and its sovereign, the woman in whose name all this was done, knew nothing of joy, but only the dull round of her ailments and her solitude, the long dragging hours of an existence from which everything had been taken that might have made it sweet. It is one of the bitterest contrasts that history affords between the splendour of the reign and the desolation of the woman who reigned, and it lends to her last years a pathos that no grandeur can lighten. There was a deep and a particular sadness in the loneliness of her ending, for she was a creature made for love and for family, who had wanted nothing so much as a houseful of children and a circle of dear friends, and she came to the end of her life stripped of nearly all of it. Her children were all in their graves, her husband was gone, the friend of her heart was estranged and exiled, her sister had died unreconciled long before, and the cousin who had comforted her later years was in the end no true friend but a self-seeker who fell away as the Queen's power to reward her waned. She sat at the summit of the world, the sovereign of a mighty and a rising nation, the namesake of a golden age, and she was, in her own person, as solitary and as sorrowful a soul as any in her kingdom, a childless widow in a great empty palace, waiting for the end. The contrast between the public glory and the private desolation has few parallels in the history of crowned heads, and it is this, above all, that gives her story its strange and haunting pathos. What lifts that pathos above mere sadness and gives it a quiet dignity is the manner in which she bore it, for there was in this suffering woman a vein of patient courage that never failed however heavy the load grew. She did not rage against her fate, nor sink into self-pity, nor let her private griefs unfit her for her public part. Sick and sorrowing as she was, she went on doing her duty to the last, sitting through the long councils of state in her pain, attending to the business of the kingdom with a conscientious care, giving to the work of a sovereign the dogged faithfulness that was the deepest note of her nature. Those who served her remarked upon it, the way the broken body housed an unbroken sense of duty, the way the suffering woman set her own misery aside to be, as well as she could, the queen her people needed. For all her plainness of mind and her want of brilliance, she had won by the end a real place in the affections of her people, who saw in her something they could love. She was no dazzling figure, no great wit or beauty or commanding genius. She was a plain, devout, suffering Englishwoman who loved her church and her country, and did her duty by both, and her subjects, who were for the most part plain devout English folk themselves, understood her and warmed to her, as they might never have warmed to a more brilliant ruler. They knew her sorrows, the long tale of her lost children, the heaviness of her afflictions, and they pitied her and were proud of her together, this homely mother figure at the head of their golden age, suffering so patiently while her armies conquered and her writers shone. And so the strange double character of the reign, the public glory and the private desolation, resolved itself at the last into something whole and even fitting, an image of patient endurance crowned with an unsought greatness. The woman had asked for none of it, neither the crown nor the glory nor the grief. They had been laid upon her by the chances of birth and the workings of Providence, and she had borne them all, the weight and the splendour and the sorrow alike, with the same quiet steadfastness, doing what was set before her to do. There is a kind of heroism in that which the louder kinds of greatness cannot match. The heroism of the ordinary soul may carry an extraordinary burden, and carrying it without complaint to the end. And it is this, more than all the victories of her armies, that gives her memory its lasting and its haunting hold. The end came in the high summer of 1714. The Queen, worn out at last, was struck down by the illness that had long been gathering in her, and for a few days she lay between life and death while the whole nation held its breath. for everyone understood that her passing might be the signal for the long-dreaded struggle over the crown. But the settlement held, and the men who guided the state made their quiet preparations. And when the Queen died at last, on the 1st day of August, in the 49th year of her age, the Hanoverian succession went through without a blow being struck. The aged Electress of Hanover, who was to have followed her, had died herself a few weeks before, and so the crown passed to that Electress's son, a stolid middle-aged German prince who could scarcely speak a word of English, and who came over the sea to be crowned as the first king of a new dynasty. The House of Stuart, which had reigned for more than 100 years, and given England and Scotland their kings and their sorrows, was ended, and the worn and weary woman who had been its last and its most tragic sovereign was carried to her rest in the great Abbey of Westminster, in a coffin almost square, so swollen had her poor body grown, and laid among the kings and queens of the line that died with her. The end, when it came swiftly, and it came amid a last flurry of the political storms that had darkened her closing years. In her very last days, with the Queen already sinking, the chief of her ministers fell from power in a final bitter quarrel, dismissed by his failing mistress only days before her death, and into the vacuum of those few frantic hours there stepped the men who were resolved that the lawful succession should not be cheated of its due. While the Queen lay dying, her counsellors moved with a quiet swiftness to secure the throne for the German house, to set the great offices in safe hands, and to leave the friends of the exiled prince no opening for a stroke, so that the succession which had hung so long in doubt was made fast, in the event, in the space of a few crowded days about the deathbed of the Queen. She died in the high summer of the year, in her quiet palace beyond the city, worn out at last by the gout and the sorrow and the long failing of her overburdened frame, not yet 50 years of age, though she seemed far older. The aged princess of the German house who should have followed her had died only a few weeks before, so that the crown passed at once to that princess's son, a middle-aged elector from over the water, who spoke scarcely a word of the language of the realm he was now to rule, and who came in time, a stranger to a strange land, to take up the inheritance the law had marked out for him, the thing that had been so long feared, the passing of the crown to the foreign house, came to pass in perfect quiet. There was no rising, no stroke, no civil war over the Queen's coffin, only the smooth and lawful transfer of the throne to the line the statesman had chosen. And with her there passed away the line of her fathers, the royal dynasty that had worn the crown of her country for more than 100 years, and the crown of the northern kingdom for centuries before that. She was the last of them to reign, the last of that famous and ill-starred family whose history had run so thick with glory and disaster, with brilliant kings and beheaded kings and exiled kings, with romance and tragedy and blood, and the line that had begun so long ago in the far north, ended at last in the swollen, suffering body of a gentle and sorrowful woman, carried to her grave in a coffin almost square, and laid among her ancestors beneath the soaring stones of the ancient abbey. The crown went on to other heads and other houses, but the old dynasty was finished, and an age ended with her. And so her story comes to its close, and it is, when we look back over the whole of it, one of the strangest mixtures of glory and grief that any life can show. She had been born to a doomed and brilliant family, and had lived to see it fall, and to be the last of it. She had endured a martyrdom of childbearing that took from her, one by one, every child she ever bore. She had lost her husband, and the friend of her life, and very nearly everything that makes a private life worth living, and she had borne it all with a quiet, dogged, uncomplaining courage that asked for no pity and made no show of its pain. And yet this sorrowful, ailing, ordinary woman who wanted nothing grander than a happy family and quiet days had presided over one of the most glorious reigns in the history of her country, had given her name to a golden age of arms and letters, had seen her armies humble the greatest power in Europe, and had joined two ancient kingdoms into one great nation that bears the shape she gave it to this day. She was not great in herself, and she never pretended to be, but greatness gathered around her, and she met both the glory and the grief of her strange high station with the same steady, patient, faithful heart, and there's a quiet heroism in that which is worth more, perhaps, than all the brilliance she lacked. If you have stayed with me through the whole of her long and bittersweet story, from the trembling chair at the coronation to the great square coffin in the abbey, then thank you for keeping me company through the few hours we have spent together. I hope she stays with you a little, the last of the Stuarts, the sorrowful queen of a golden age, a woman who lost so much and bore it so bravely, and gave her sad and gentle name to one of the brightest seasons her country ever knew. If these long evenings in vanished centuries are something you would like to find your way back to, you are welcome to subscribe, and another life, another age, another story will be waiting for you whenever you need it. There is no hurry. There never is, here. Sleep well. Stay warm. Be kind to the people in your house. And I will see you in the next one. Good night.